London in the 1800s was a city split between two realities. On one side, grand homes flickered with gaslight, filled with warmth, laughter, and the steady glow of hearth fires. On the other, narrow slums trapped the cold, where thin alleys funneled wind straight into the bones of the forgotten. Winter in Victorian London wasn't just a season, it was a daily battle, a ruthless test of survival that exposed the harsh line between privilege and poverty. The wealthy bought warmth, the poor had to earn it, sometimes with their lives. Picture it, the fog thickened in the winter air until entire blocks dissolved into ghostly silence. Hooves rang out over frozen stone, and iron shoes of street sweepers sparked in the cold. Families clung together beneath warm blankets, their breath visible in rooms no warmer than the air outside. Children coughed in rags, chests tight from soot and frost. For them, winter held no beauty, no joy, only the cold edge of endurance. But in the heart of that struggle lived strength. Moments of quiet victory, glimpses of a society slowly waking to the price of its industrial age. This isn't just a story of icy winds and frozen streets. It's about the chill of hunger, of disease, of being unseen. It's about what it meant to survive in a city that could freeze your body and harden your soul. But before we step into the smoke and frost of the past, let's take a moment to connect. If this is your first time here, welcome to History to Sleep, a place where the past is told, not just in facts, but in feeling. Drop a comment below, tell us what time it is where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. Maybe it's late in Toronto and the wind taps against your window, or maybe it's dawn in Copenhagen, and your coffee steams beside you. Wherever you are, you're part of this moment. So settle in, pull the blanket closer, and imagine stepping into a city lit by gaslight, buried in smoke. A place where frost laced every glass pane, and survival came down to a few embers, or a stranger's mercy. This is Victorian London in winter. Brutal, beautiful, unforgettable. The first and most relentless force to face in a Victorian winter wasn't hunger or disease. It was the weather itself. Not just cold, but a numbing, creeping freeze that worked its way through stone walls, thick coats, and even the toughest spirits. For those living in 1800s London, frost wasn't a passing inconvenience. It was a constant companion, waiting outside the window, and often inside it. The city's climate carried a cruel signature. Dampness seemed stitched into the very air. The low-lying land collected cold, and when wind swept through, it met that ever-present moisture with vicious results. The chill was not just on the skin, it sank into bones, joints, and breath. This wasn't the sharp, crisp winter of the north. London's cold was subtler. It didn't bite, it soaked. And then came the fog. Thick, suffocating, and legendary. The city's infamous pea soupers reached their worst in the colder months. Imagine stepping into a dense, yellow-grey curtain so heavy you couldn't see the end of your own arm. These weren't ordinary mists. They were toxic, mixing coal smoke with damp air to form a choking cloud that reeked of sulfur and ash. Horses lost their footing, carriages collided blindly, and people wandered lost in their own streets. At times the fog was so persistent it oozed indoors, staining curtains and turning clean clothes a sickly brown. Snow was less common, but never gentle. A serious snowfall could freeze entire districts. Streets turned into slick danger zones, and the city ground to a halt under the weight of ice. Children might have laughed while sliding across frozen paths, but for those without sturdy shoes or shelter, snow brought disaster. Slush soaked through rags, wrapped around feet, pipes froze solid, rooftops groaned under layers of frost. Without a safe place to retreat, snow became more than a season. It became a silent predator. And then there was the wind. It didn't howl. It hunted. Racing down narrow alleys, it crept into every crack in every wall. It swept through tenement windows, whistled beneath warped floorboards, and stripped warmth from every corner it touched. There was no insulation, no double-pane glass, no central heat. A single gust could turn a cramped living space into something colder than the street outside. Even before hunger arrived, even before sickness took root, nature had already declared war on London. And for those without means to resist it, every winter became a long, unrelenting fight. The weather didn't merely inconvenience the poor, it crushed them. If the weather was the enemy, then fire was the only defense. In Victorian London, warmth wasn't just about comfort, It was a daily struggle that shaped how people lived, moved, and survived. For the wealthy it was simple. They ordered more coal, stocked their hearths, and watched flames dance behind polished grates. But for the poor, who made up the vast majority, warmth was an ongoing battle. It was exhausting, degrading, and sometimes it was long. Coal was the heartbeat of every home. Without it, there was no heat, no hot meals, no protection from the damp that seeped into bones and blankets. In grand homes, it arrived in heaps, cart after cart, unloaded into deep cellars, where servants kept fires burning day and night. The flicker of flame reflected off velvet curtains and silver, making even the darkest nights feel secure, even charming. But in the crowded, crumbling neighborhoods of the poor, things were different. Coal wasn't bought by the ton. It was bought by the handful. Vendors pushed through the streets with sacks and scuttles, calling out prices while desperate mothers haggled over what they could spare. A bucket of coal could mean one warm night or none at all. When there was no money for coal, families turned to whatever would burn. Old chairs, broken crates, bits of fabric. Anything that could be lit was fed to the fire in a desperate attempt to hold off the cold. Children searched alleyways and rail yards for stray lumps that had fallen from wagons. Others sifted through ashes, hoping to find pieces that still held a spark. The air inside these homes grew thick and acrid. Smoke hung low. It burned eyes, stung lungs. But it was better than the silence of the cold. Without fire, nights were long and cruel. Bodies huddled together under threadbare covers. Rooms felt like caves of frost. And sometimes, people simply didn't wake up. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While the wealthy warmed themselves beside roaring fireplaces, the poor crouched around a single flicker, stretching out their hands, soaking up every second of heat. Many couldn't afford to burn anything during the day. Fires were lit only to cook, then left to die. Even public shelters offered little relief. Workhouses, designed to offer safety, were freezing. Fires were sparse and rationed, leaving residents to shiver in vast, echoing rooms. For those with no home at all, the streets offered only stone and wind. Some found space in shelters, crammed together for warmth. Others hid under bridges, in stairwells, in corners of railway stations, anywhere that offered the slightest break from the biting air. This wasn't just a matter of staying warm, it was a matter of staying alive. Fire wasn't a luxury, it was a line between life and death, and everyone knew it. From the coalman shouting in the street, to the child shivering in silence. In the long fight of winter, coal was more than fuel, it was survival, measured one ember at a time. When winter settled over Victorian London, clothing became the only armor many had against the relentless cold. But like everything else in the city, what you wore told a story of class, of struggle, of improvisation. For the fortunate, heavy layers turned the chill into an inconvenience. For the poor, thin rags left them exposed to every icy gust. The well-off dressed for the season in style. Gentlemen walked through the fog-wrapped streets in tailored wool overcoats, sharp and snug, collars lined with fur to block the wind. Top hats sat firm on their heads, and fine gloves wrapped their hands in soft leather. Women wore long cloaks that draped gracefully over layered dresses, with velvet muffs warming their hands, and polished boots shielding their feet. Stockings were thick, undergarments were layered, every piece designed not only to insulate, but to impress. For them, clothing wasn't just about warmth. It was about elegance, a way to show comfort, even in the depths of winter. But for the working poor, clothes were stitched together from scraps and survival. There was no money for new coats, no shelves lined with options. Garments were passed down, patched and repatched until thread barely held fabric. Shoes cracked and split, letting in the icy sludge of the streets. Many children trudged barefoot, their toes raw and purple. Others tied rags around their feet and hoped for mercy from the frost. Hats, if they had them, were battered and thin. Scarves were old cloths wrapped tight against their cheeks. Layering wasn't a choice. It was the only defense. They wore every piece they owned. Shirts under worn sweaters, skirts over trousers, sleeves stitched onto sleeves. And at night, they didn't undress. Clothes doubled as blankets. To remove them, even for washing, was to invite the cold in. Winter garments stiffened with dirt and damp, but they were too valuable to be left aside. Washing was a risk many couldn't afford. Clothing marked your place in the world. Chimney sweeps walked black with soot, still in the same tattered outfits they worked in. Match girls pulled thin shawls tighter around their shoulders, trying to disappear into the fog. Meanwhile, the upper class looked untouched by the cold, wrapped in layers that made them seem distant, almost above the suffering around them. But even in the poorest corners, you could find resilience. Mothers stitched together bits of cloth into makeshift mittens. Fathers patched boots with scraps of leather salvaged from factory waste. Neighbors shared what they had, passing coats between families, so no child had to walk through snow completely exposed. In Victorian London, to dress warmly was a symbol of fortune. To be dressed at all was often a battle. Every scarf, every coat, every pair of boots told a story, not just of the cold, but of the grit people carried to make it through. If fire kept the cold at bay, food was what kept life going. In Victorian London, what you had or didn't have to eat shaped whether you made it through the winter or faded in it. The human body needs more energy when it's cold, burning through calories just to stay warm. But for the city's poor, calories were a luxury, and hunger was just another enemy that never left. For the wealthy, winter meant comfort. Inside the kitchens of their townhouses, cooks bustled with purpose. Roasts of lamb or beef filled the air with rich smells. Pies steamed with meat and vegetables. Soups bubbled thick with flavor, and puddings, heavy with dried fruits and sugar, waited by the fire. Hot tea, cocoa, or mulled wine warmed chilled hands. Bread came fresh, buttered, and plentiful. There was always more than enough, and more still. Food for them wasn't just fuel. It was pleasure, tradition, security. It was warmth in every bite. But for the poor, food was a daily gamble, a matter of what could be stretched, what could be borrowed, or what could be skipped. In one-room homes, families survived on bread crusts, porridge made from drippings, or watery broth, where a single bone might be used for days. Potatoes were everything, cheap, filling, and cookable, even over the smallest fire. On the street, vendors offered roasted chestnuts or hot eels, small bites that promised at least a moment of relief. But often, even that was out of reach. Hunger was constant, and winter made it worse. Malnutrition crept in quietly. Children already in rags grew thinner, their faces hollowed, their energy dimmed. Cold bodies without food lost the strength to fight. Illness followed, and without proper meals, recovery rarely came. Mothers gave their portions to their children. Fathers went without. Some wasted away not from disease, but from quiet starvation. Workhouses offered meals, but they came with a cost. Your dignity, gruel, bread, barely enough. And for many, pride kept them outside the doors, until desperation forced them in. Cooking also required fuel, and without coal, even the food you had might go uneaten. A stale piece of bread, dipped in cold water, could be a full dinner. Some found a few pennies for public cookshops, where they could buy something hot. Not always tasty, but hot. Others had no choice at all. Gin shops stayed busy in winter. For a few coins, a person could buy warmth. Not real warmth, but the illusion of it. The drink dulled the hunger, drowned out the cold. But when it wore off, the body was left weaker. The fire inside burned out faster. In this city, food was never just food. It was a measure of your place in the world. The rich turned winter into a season of indulgence. But for the poor, every meal was a milestone. Every bite was hard-won, and hunger never knocked. It lived with you. If warmth kept the body from freezing, and food gave it strength, then shelter was the last line of defense. But in Victorian London, not all shelter offered safety. Where you lived determined how winter treated you, whether it passed in comfort or cut straight through your bones. For the wealthy, homes were strongholds. Brick townhouses in places like Kensington or Mayfair stood tall, with high ceilings, thick rugs, and staff to stoke the fires. Coal cellars stayed full, curtains hung heavy, every room glowed with warmth. Even stairwells felt alive with heat, as fireplaces roared on every floor. Winter for them was a backdrop, something seen from behind glass, softened by candlelight. But in East London's overcrowded slums, shelter meant little more than a space to exist. Families crammed into one damp room, sometimes sharing it with strangers. The The walls were thin. The roofs leaked. Drafts pushed frost through the cracks. Rain stained ceilings. The smell of rot lingered. And the cold? It lived in the walls. Windows rattled in their frames. If they weren't broken, they were too thin to stop anything. Many rooms didn't even have chimneys. Fires were impossible. People wrapped themselves in every bit of cloth they owned, and still lay shivering through the night. Overcrowding made things worse. Dozens packed into buildings stacked on top of each other. There was no privacy, no quiet. The air was thick with smoke from shared cooking fires, and the damp breath of wet clothes drying indoors. The smell of unwashed garments mixed with mildew. The cold seeped in through everything. And for the homeless, shelter meant whatever could be found. A railway station corner, a stairwell, a bridge. Some nights, even that wasn't available. Night shelters filled fast. People squeezed together, shoulder to shoulder, fighting off the cold with nothing but body heat. There were no blankets, no beds, just the hope that morning would come. Inside workhouses, conditions were barely better. Meant to be places of last resort, they offered bare-bones relief. The fires were few. The halls were cold. And though they offered a roof, they often stripped people of any dignity they had left. In this city, shelter wasn't guaranteed safety. For the rich, homes were cocoons, quiet, sealed, glowing with warmth. But for the poor, shelter could feel like a trap, a coffin made of brick, wrapped in frost, echoing with coughs and footsteps. It wasn't just about having a roof. It was about whether that roof held the cold out or let it settle in with you. Winter in Victorian London wasn't just a season. It was a mirror, one that reflected who had power and who had nothing. The weather didn't care. It pushed against everyone. But only some had the means to push back. For the privileged, the season passed behind thick curtains, beside warm fires, with plates full of food and boots that kept the frost at bay. For the rest, it was a fight. A constant calculation. How to stay warm, how to stretch food, how to keep the wind from finding you in your sleep. But in that struggle, you also find something deeper, a quiet strength. The way families held each other through long, frozen nights. The way neighbors shared scraps and coats and coal. The way children laughed in snow, even barefoot and cold. Survival wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental, a refusal to give in. This is the side of history that often gets left out. The human part. The part where people didn't just live through the past. They endured it, and in doing so, they left behind more than just records and ruins. They left behind proof that even in the harshest winters, there is always warmth in the will to go on. So wherever you're listening from, wrapped in a blanket or walking through a city of your own, know this. The cold may be old, but the resilience that faced it is timeless. This was Victorian London, in winter, unforgiving, unforgettable, undeniably human. Some lay curled beneath railway bridges, hidden in the shadows, their bodies wrapped in sacks or layers of old newspaper. Others huddled in building doorways, barely distinguishable beneath piles of worn-out cloth. A lucky few found space in night shelters, rows of rigid benches packed with people pressed together for warmth. These shelters offered a break from the wind, but not from the freezing cold. Still, for those with nowhere else to turn, it was a chance to survive another night. Even the dreaded workhouses became a kind of refuge during the winter months. Families who had long resisted entering, clinging to pride, often surrendered when the chill became too much to bear. Inside, life was far from easy. Fires were scarce, warmth even scarcer, but walls were walls, and sometimes that was enough to keep death at a distance. In Victorian London, having shelter wasn't about comfort, it was about making it to the morning. The wealthy closed their windows against the frost and went on with their evenings, tucked inside insulated homes. The poor, by contrast, might spend the same night awake, teeth chattering, hoping the roof wouldn't collapse under the weight of snow. Shelter meant the difference between living and dying, and in winter that line was cut straight across class. For the poor, winter brought no pause, no mercy. Work didn't stop just because the streets turned to ice or the air turned to smoke. In fact, the colder it got, the more urgent the need to earn. Every coin became a chance to buy bread, to purchase a scrap of coal, or maybe to pay for a place to sleep. So they worked. Men, women, and even the smallest children pushed themselves through the icy months, driven not by ambition but by survival. Out on the streets, vendors stood in the wind selling whatever they could manage. Boxes of matches, roasted chestnuts, hot pies, or cheap ornaments. Standing still in the cold was its own kind of torture. Some wore worn-out boots with holes. Others had nothing on their feet at all. Skin pressed to slush and stone. To keep warm, they stamped their feet and rubbed their hands, wrapped in mismatched layers that barely held in the heat. The same fog that made it impossible for carriages to see also swallowed their voices. Matches, hot pies, they'd call into the mist, over and over, trying to be heard. Their breath turned white with every shout. They were tired, so tired, but without a sail, there'd be no food, no warmth, no hope. Labourers faced even crueler conditions. Dock workers unloaded ships while freezing waves slapped their skin, turning water to ice on their sleeves. Their hands swelled and cracked from the cold. Bricklayers and street sweepers fought frozen joints to keep working. In factories, though shielded from wind, the halls were frigid. Machinery clanked and echoed, but the warmth from the engines never reached far enough. Workers wore their coats while they worked, trying to keep the cold at bay. And women's work offered no more comfort. Laundresses spent hours with their hands plunged in icy basins, scrubbing clothes for others, while their own fingers cracked and bled. Match girls wandered miles, selling tiny boxes for a few coins, their shawls too thin to protect against the cold. Domestic servants rose in darkness, lighting fires in grand homes while shivering themselves. They warmed the homes of others, never their own. Even children weren't spared. Boys called mudlarks scoured the frozen banks of the river, searching for scraps, bits of rope, coal, anything to sell. Others ran errands in snow, fetched water, or climbed inside soot-filled chimneys, their small bodies aching and cold. Starving, underdressed, already weak, they worked anyway. Sickness followed closely behind. Winter turned dangerous jobs into deadly ones. Slippery roads led to falls, broken limbs. Scaffolds collapsed under the weight of frost. Carriages crashed in thick fog, injuring those too close. But still, workers showed up. Because staying home didn't mean safety, it meant starvation. In the wealthier parts of town, passers-by glanced at these workers, sometimes with pity, often with nothing. Their gloved hands stayed tucked in fur, their boots dry. But for the poor, winter work wasn't about choice. It was life, fought for hour by hour, in the wind, in the cold, and always under the threat of hunger. If cold and hunger weren't enough, winter in Victorian London brought another silent danger: disease. In a city already smothered by smoke and packed with bodies, frost didn't kill germs, it trapped them. The cold season created the perfect storm for illness to spread, moving through homes, factories, and crowded alleyways, striking hardest at those who were already weak and worn down. The most common killer was anything that attacked the lungs. The damp, freezing air crept into chests and stayed there, breeding sickness. Bronchitis, pneumonia, tuberculosis, illnesses that began with a cough and ended in silence. The dreaded consumption haunted the city. Winter gave it strength. Children with sunken cheeks coughed through the night, their small bodies rattling while exhausted mothers tried to keep them warm with nothing more than rags. Adults, weakened by endless labor and poor food, had no strength left to fight infection. Once sickness took hold, it rarely let go. And the fog? It didn't help. London's infamous smog, thick with soot, ash, and sulfur, poisoned the very breath people needed to live. Those already weak struggled to breathe, gasping in the streets, clutching walls for support. Even the healthy found their eyes burning, their throats raw. Doctors began reporting something they called fog fever, a vague term that meant one thing: the air itself was making people sick. And every winter, as chimneys poured more smoke into the sky, more people fell ill. It wasn't just the lungs that suffered. The damp air worked its way into joints and bones, worsening rheumatism. Workers limped, their bodies stiff with pain, their movement slowed. Frostbite struck hard, especially at night, blackening toes and fingers of those left to sleep outside or work all day with soaked boots. For those with no home, the results were often fatal. Corpses were found under bridges, behind shops, frozen in place where they'd last curled up. Stiff limbs, icy skin. In tenement houses packed too full, one sick child could bring down an entire building. Illness moved fast through the cold air, and unwashed rooms. From family to family, measles, whooping cough, influenza, the winter made them all stronger. With windows sealed tight and bedding never properly cleaned, the poor had no defense. Disease didn't just visit, it lived among them. And medical help? Nearly impossible. The poor couldn't afford a doctor, and those who turned to workhouses for help often found more sickness waiting inside. Hundreds of desperate souls, coughing in cold, crammed into damp halls with little food and even less care. Disease spread like fire. The very places meant to provide safety often became places where people went to die. Meanwhile, the wealthy watched from a distance. Their homes were warm, their meals were rich, their doctors came to them. And though illness still touched the upper classes, recovery was far more likely. Once again, winter drew its cruel line. One side suffered with blankets and broth. The other side had nothing but prayer. Disease in winter wasn't a surprise. It was part of the season. Every year, death came with the frost. With each breath, each cough, each icy wall. In Victorian London, winter didn't just bring cold, it brought fear of all those swallowed by the fog and frost. No one felt the weight of winter more than the children. They were the smallest, the weakest, and the least protected. In narrow alleys and streets dark with soot, childhood was not a time of play. It was a fight to stay warm, to stay fed, to stay alive. In the homes of the wealthy, children were wrapped in warmth. Wool coats, fur-lined boots, thick stockings, fires burned in their nurseries. Servants tucked them into soft beds with heavy quilts. Their winters were stories, games, and laughter. Snow was a treat, a time for sleigh rides and snowmen. But for the poor, winter was merciless. Most children didn't even have shoes. They trudged barefoot through icy puddles, skin purple with cold. Their clothes were barely clothes-patched, so many times that fabric barely held together. When snow fell, they didn't play in it. They scavenged. They searched for coal or scraps of food or anything they could carry for a few coins. Hunger made winter even crueler. A child who hadn't eaten couldn't stay warm. Their stomachs ached, their faces sank, their bodies trembled without stop, and with cold and hunger came sickness, tuberculosis, pneumonia, whooping cough, diseases that filled graveyards with tiny markers. Parents mourned, but mourning never lasted long. The day still needed to be survived. And the work? It never stopped for children. Chimney sweeps, many no older than 7 or 8, were sent crawling up flues in bitter cold. Their arms scratched raw, their legs shaking. Match girls walked miles, whispering offers to buy a box for a penny, their hands too numb to hold them. Mudlarks combed the freezing riverbanks, digging through frozen muck for bits of rope or metal, anything they could sell. Their fingers, barely healed from yesterday, worked again today. These children carried the weight of survival on bodies too young to carry it. And yet, somehow, they found moments to smile. They huddled together for warmth, shared bites of bread, and sometimes, just sometimes, forgot the cold. A chestnut vendor might offer one for free. A snowball might fly through an alley. A laugh might echo where only crying had been. Even in all that misery, their innocence flickered. Fragile, brave. The difference between rich and poor children mirrored all of Victorian society, harsh, unforgiving, divided by money. For some, winter was a storybook season. For others, it stole their childhood before it had even begun. Winter in Victorian London didn't just expose the cold in the streets. It revealed the quiet strength of the women who bore the weight of survival. Whether mothers, daughters, or labourers, they carried a burden that few noticed and even fewer praised. For wealthier women, the season brought inconvenience, but never danger. They lived in warm homes, tended by servants, fires were lit before they awoke, and wardrobes held thick silks, soft wool, and fur-lined coats. Their winters were filled with social events, theatre outings, and holiday gatherings by candlelight. But for women in the working class and the slums, winter was relentless. It meant harder days, longer nights, and endless choices between dignity and survival. Mothers faced the cruelest decisions. They gave their children the last scraps of food, then went hungry themselves. They tore up their own shawls to wrap around freezing little bodies. Every day demanded sacrifice. One more coat pawned, one more meal skipped, one more night without sleep. and work didn't pause for the cold. Laundresses plunged their hands into freezing water, scrubbing the clothes of the wealthy while their own hands cracked and bled. Washhouses were cold and damp, echoing with labor but offering no relief. There was no fire, only the sting of cold water and the weight of another load. Seamstresses sat in dim, cold rooms, stitching garments for pennies, the needle slipping through numb fingers. Long hours, poor light, and frost-bitten hands. And on the streets, women faced the elements head-on. Some sold flowers, others matches, or simple trinkets. They stood in sleet and snow, thin shawls clinging to their skin, voices hoarse from calling out. Some had infants strapped to their chests, their cries muffled by layers of cloth. They worked while their babies shivered. Exhaustion was common. Many collapsed on street corners, too tired to go on, too poor to stop. A full day's work might not buy more than a crust of bread or a few lumps of coal. Yet somehow they endured. They kept families alive. They lit the fires each morning and put the children to sleep each night. They patched clothes again and again until there was nothing left to sew. They sat beside the sick and buried the dead, then returned to the same tasks the next morning. Their strength wasn't loud. It was steady. It was invisible, but it was vital. While men labored on docks or in factories, it was women who kept the household from falling apart. They bore the double weight of work and care. Winter didn't spare them, but it showed their strength. History rarely records their names, but without them, families wouldn't have survived the cold. If life inside the tenements was difficult, life on the streets was something else entirely. For the homeless in Victorian London, winter was not just dangerous. It was deadly. The cold had no pity, no walls, no limits. And in a city where thousands had nothing, many faced the season with only rags, empty stomachs, and sheer will. They slept where they could, under the arches of railway bridges, in the corners of shop entrances, along the river's edge. Some curled on stone, some on dirt, many on nothing at all. Wrapped in old sacks or layers of newspaper, they clung to whatever warmth they could find. And some never woke up. By morning, the cold had done its work. Their bodies were still stiff. Constables knew the routine. After a bitter frost, they found corpses in alleys, on stairwells, behind buildings, people who had simply run out of chances. There were public shelters, but not enough. Those lucky enough to get inside found little comfort, just a patch of floor or a narrow bench, crammed in beside dozens of others. The air was thick with coughing, the smell of damp clothes, and desperation. Fires, if there were any, barely warmed the room, but still, it was better than the street. Workhouses were another option, though one wrapped in shame. Entering meant giving up your freedom. Families were separated, men to one side, women to another, children taken elsewhere. Even if a roof and a meal waited inside, the price was steep. Some couldn't bear it. They chose the streets, even if it meant freezing. And the children, the homeless children, were the most haunting. Orphans, runaways, left to fend for themselves. They clustered under bridges, beside markets, anywhere there was cover. They shared scraps, traded warmth, and sometimes joined gangs just to stay alive. Others stood alone on corners, hands outstretched, asking for coins with cracked voices. A single penny could mean bread, or maybe a spot in a cheap lodging house for one night. If no one gave, back to the cold. The rich passed them by. Sometimes they tossed a coin, sometimes they turned away. Some felt pity, others felt nothing. One side debated winter fashion. The other side froze. Winter didn't hide its cruelty. It left it out in the open in every numb hand, every empty belly, every body found curled in the shadows. On the streets of Victorian London, the cold didn't knock. It barged in, for the homeless. Every night was a gamble, and too often, winter was. In the harsh winters of Victorian London, no institution cast a larger shadow over the poor than the workhouse. For some, it offered a lifeline, a roof, a meal, and a small chance at surviving the cold. But, for most, it was a place of dread, a symbol of lost freedom, broken families, and a survival that came at the cost of everything else. After the Poor Law reforms of 1834, getting help meant giving up your independence. The system was designed to discourage reliance on charity, so the workhouse was made intentionally harsh, unforgiving rules, bare conditions, and a constant reminder that this was not kindness. This was control, and when winter came, everything got worse. As the frost settled over the city, the desperate gathered outside the gates of London's workhouses. Shivering in threadbare coats, they waited, hoping for a spot inside. But not all were allowed in. If the halls were full, people were turned away, left to brave the night outside. Those who were accepted faced something just as painful. Families were immediately separated, men to one wing, women to another, children taken elsewhere. The bond of family, already frayed by poverty, was cut at the door. Inside, warmth was scarce. Fires, if they burned at all, gave little heat. The ceiling stretched high above, trapping what little warmth there was. People huddled on benches, or lay in narrow beds, packed shoulder to shoulder. The meals were plain, but regular. A bowl of gruel, some bread, perhaps a ladle of broth. It wasn't comfort, but in a city where hunger chased you down every street, it was something. In return, the workhouse demanded labor. No one stayed for free. Men were sent to break stones or unravel old rope with their bare hands until their fingers bled. Some worked outdoors, lifting heavy loads in frozen yards, the cold cutting through every layer of cloth. Women scrubbed floors, hauled laundry through icy water, or stitched clothes until their knuckles locked. Even the children worked, dragging loads, picking fibers, assigned chores far beyond their strength. Illness spread quickly in these cramped halls. Coughs turned to infections, winter colds became pneumonia, and with so many already weak, the workhouse often became less a refuge and more a final stop. Still, for many, there was no better choice. A place to lie down, 3 meals, and walls to keep the wind out. That was more than the street could offer. The system may have seemed efficient to those who designed it, but to the poor who lived it, it was a place of humiliation. In winter, especially, the workhouse stood as proof. If you needed help, it would cost you everything. It was part refuge, part punishment. A space where survival meant surrender, and where the warmth you received never matched what you gave up to get it. The streets of Victorian London were always alive with noise and motion. But when winter arrived, they changed completely. Frost, fog, and struggle turned the city into something else entirely. A stage of hardship where everyone, rich or poor, played their part. Step outside, in the depth of winter, and the first thing you'd feel wasn't the sound or the crowd. It was the air. A thick, yellowed fog hung heavy, soaked in coal smoke. It clung to skin and crept into lungs. Street lamps flickered behind the haze, casting ghostly glows that barely lit the outlines of buildings. And the cold? It didn't just bite, it cut deep, slipping through clothes and soaking straight to the bone. The cobblestones were slick, coated in slush and ice. Rain turned to frost overnight. Horses slipped, their iron hooves struggling for grip as they pulled heavy carriages. The poor crossed these streets in worn-out boots, or no shoes at all. Feet wrapped in rags, they shuffled across puddles crusted with ice, toes numb and blue. Children stumbled, sometimes laughing, but more often crying, when the wet chill seeped through their thin clothes. Street vendors, whose lives depended on selling in public, stood for hours in that freezing fog. Their cries, hot chestnuts, fresh pies, faded into the mist, barely heard by passers-by, and yet they kept calling, desperate to draw attention before the cold robbed them of both voice and sales. Most of them were women and children, wrapped in shawls too thin to block the wind. They clutched baskets as steam rose from their goods, the only warmth they had. For beggars, the streets offered little more than humiliation. Huddled in corners, sprawled on stone steps, they held out trembling hands. Some received a coin, many did not. In richer neighborhoods they were pushed aside by constables, eyesores to be removed. In poorer areas they simply blended in with the crowd, one more soul swallowed by winter. Fog brought danger. Carriages emerged from the mist without warning, splashing ice-cold water onto those in their path. Accidents were constant. Horses reared, carts toppled, panic echoed through narrow streets. And in that chaos, thieves found opportunity. They moved like shadows, slipping through the fog, snatching coins, food, anything they could grab. Gone before a cry could go up. Yet despite the cold, the hunger, and the fear, there was something else in the streets. community. People shared. Workers passed around scraps of bread. Vendors let someone warm their hands near the fire. Children gathered in tight circles, holding each other for comfort. Even in misery, there were flickers of connection. Winter turned London's streets into something more than just pathways. They became places of risk and resilience, of loss and survival. For the poor, every step was uncertain. A fall, an accident, a missed sale. Any of these could be a tipping point. The streets didn't stop moving, even when the snow fell. But for many, walking them in winter wasn't just a journey. It was a fight to stay alive. In Victorian London, the city never stood still, not even in winter. People still had to move, workers to jobs, vendors to stalls, the wealthy to dinners and theatres. But once the cold tightened its grip, every journey became a challenge. Snow, fog, and ice turned movement into risk. Whether by foot, by horse, or by carriage, travelling through the city in winter was a test of patience and survival. For the wealthy, carriages were the transport of choice. The wheels clattered over frozen cobblestones, the passengers bundled under heavy blankets, faintly lit by the warm flicker of carriage lamps. But even luxury couldn't outrun danger. The thick fog wrapped the city in blindness. Drivers could barely see ahead. Horses stumbled on hidden patches of ice, their hooves sliding without warning. Carriages veered off track, carts overturned, horses bolted in panic. For those inside, it meant delays and discomfort. For the coachmen and stable boys, it meant real danger. They were the ones guiding blind through the fog, exposed to the cold, sometimes crushed in the chaos. But the poor, there were no options for them. Miles of slush and stone had to be crossed, no matter the weather. Men trudged through sleet to reach the docks or factories. Boots, if they had them, were often falling apart. Many walked with feet wrapped in cloth, soaked and frozen before the sun even rose. Women carried goods, pushed carts, or held children close, their bodies leaning against icy winds. One wrong step on a slippery stone could mean a broken leg, and for a labourer, that could mean starvation. Street sweepers tried to keep up. Armed with brooms and shovels, they cleared paths for carriages and foot traffic. But the snow fell faster than they could clear it. Their work was endless, brutal, and badly paid. Yet without them, the streets would have stopped entirely. Omnibuses and horse-drawn cabs struggled too. Drivers leaned forward into the fog, shouting stops as their wheels skidded over slick roads. Fares went up in winter. Fewer vehicles dared the journey. For the poor, this meant walking longer distances, even through snowstorms, even in sickness. And then there was the Thames. The great river that cut through London became a different kind of obstacle in winter. Sometimes it froze. Not entirely, but enough to disrupt everything. Ferries struggled, trade slowed, boats fought against chunks of ice, their hulls cracking in the cold. Supplies were delayed. Coal, food, everything the city needed moved slower. For the poor, this meant higher prices and even more hunger. But the river didn't just freeze. It became a path. Some, in desperation, used the icy banks as shortcuts. They walked along the edges, trying to shave off minutes from long journeys. It was dangerous. The ice could give way. One wrong step, and the freezing water would swallow them whole. Still, they took the risk, because sometimes there wasn't another choice. The wealthy might complain of delays or stalled deliveries, but for the poor, every winter journey was a gamble, step by frozen step. The cold didn't just test endurance. It tested balance, strength, and luck. And for those without money or safety, travel through the city became one more battle in a season full of them. In the heart of a city wrapped in fog and ice, two things stood between life and death: fire and light. Without them, winter in Victorian London was more than cold. It was consuming. Darkness crept in early and stayed late. The sun, when it appeared, was weak and distant. Most of the time, smoke-filled skies smothered it completely. Street lamps flickered behind veils of soot, casting more shadow than glow. Inside tenement rooms, candles burned low, if there was wax to burn at all. Fires were small, often nothing more than glowing embers in cracked grates. And yet, these weak flames were everything. A handful of coal meant a child could stop shaking. A single candle meant a mother could sew into the night. For the poor, fire was more than warmth. It was hope. It was company. In a room with frozen walls and damp floors, a flame gave the illusion, if only briefly, that survival was possible. But coal cost money. Candles cost money. Oil, wood, even rags to burn, all cost something. So fires were rationed, families gathered close, huddling around whatever heat they could manage. Mothers fed the flames with scraps, breaking up furniture, tearing cloth, burning anything that could catch. Some didn't light fires at all. They couldn't afford to. Instead, they lay beneath piles of fabric, breathing into their hands, whispering stories to distract the children from the cold. Outside, the streets were lit by gas lamps, their glow stretched thin by fog. Vendors carried small fires with them, braziers that hissed and steamed in the night air. People stopped near them, not to buy, but to warm their fingers for a moment before moving on. The glow of a chestnut stand wasn't just about hunger, it was about survival. And for those with no shelter at all, fire was the only defense against death. They built makeshift hearths under bridges. They clutched broken lanterns. They gathered around piles of smoldering rubbish, breathing in smoke just to feel warmth. To the wealthy, fire and light were always there. Logs crackled in marble fireplaces. Lamps burned steadily in every room. Light was a background detail, not a lifeline. But for the poor, these were not luxuries. They were the thin thread that kept the cold from taking everything. In a city where the frost waited at every window and the darkness crept through every crack, fire and light were more than comfort. They were the last defense, the final shield, the fragile heartbeat of winter survival. A season when the city itself felt like it turned its back on the human soul. Every corner, every silent hallway seemed to carry the weight of the cold. In that bitter stretch of months, it was warmth and light that held the line between life and surrender. For the fortunate, fire was a constant companion. Their stately homes overflowed with coal, fireplaces blazing in nearly every room. Servants moved through polished hallways, ensuring every grate crackled to life before the sun had even risen. The glow of flames reflected off marble mantels and velvet drapes, casting a golden hush across thick carpets. Children studied beside the hearth, the steady rhythm of the flames wrapping around their words. Families gathered beneath the soft flicker of candles and oil lamps, cocooned in comfort. Fire for them wasn't merely survival, it was pleasure, an invitation to joy. It transformed winter into something celebratory, not threatening. But beyond the warmth of those well-lit rooms, fire was not so easy to come by. For the working poor, each match struck was a decision. Coal was costly, and many households couldn't afford enough to burn through the night. Instead, they measured it out with careful hands, rationing each piece as though it were gold. A single bucket might have to last 3, even 4 days. Rooms stayed cold, their breath visible in the air. Some gathered whatever they could. Splinters of wood, animal waste, even the legs of a broken chair. Children were sent to the riverbanks, gathering anything that might burn. Others hovered near delivery routes, hoping to snatch coal that spilled from carts. On the coldest nights, families clung to one another beneath layers of coats and blankets, sharing the only heat they had left. Each other. A few smouldering coals nursed overnight were guarded like sacred embers, coaxed back to life come morning. For them, fire wasn't a given. It was a struggle. Light held just as much weight. Winter didn't just bring cold, it dragged the sun down with it. Days swallowed by thick fog, and endless night. The wealthier households lit beeswax candles, their light soft and clean. The poor used tallow, its smoke harsh, its flame unreliable. Oil lamps flickered on windowsills, trying and often failing to hold back the darkness outside. The thick London fog, what people called the pea soupers, rolled down the streets like a living thing. Gas lamps gave faint halos through the mist, their reach barely touching alley walls. But even these belonged mostly to wealthier streets. The poor districts fell into shadow after dusk. Those who walked home through them stepped into risk of robbery, of violence, or simply of falling into unseen puddles or open drains. And the loss of light wasn't just inconvenience, it drained something deeper. Without fire, the body weakened. Without light, the mind sank. But when a spark finally danced in the grate, or a tiny flame trembled against the dark, it reminded Londoners, no matter where they stood, that even in the most unforgiving cold, something alive remained, a reason to keep going. Even amid the cold breath of Victorian winter, people sought something more than just survival. They wanted joy, distraction, a moment to remember that life could still be beautiful. Winter entertainment became the city's quiet rebellion, a way to say that frost and fog would not be the final word. But as with everything in this era, that escape was not equal for all. For those with means, winter became a glittering calendar of diversion. The theatres filled with Shakespeare's echoes, laughter from music halls, operas swelling with grandeur. Velvet seats cushioned the audience while gaslight threw gold against gilded ceilings. Men in wool coats leaned back with cigars during intermissions. Women draped in silks whispered from behind fans. These weren't just performances, they were rituals, acts of luxury that made the dark outside feel very far away. Nights were filled with balls and formal dinners, their tables heavy with game birds and candied fruits. Rooms were dressed in pine and holly, candles catching in glass ornaments. Christmas, especially, became an indulgence. Trees glittered, children received gifts wrapped in ribbon. Their joy echoed in rooms warmed by more than fire. For the growing middle class, these joys came in smaller doses, but no less treasured. A family gathered in the parlour. Someone played piano while others sang. A card game stretched through the evening, or a passage from Dickens was read aloud as feet warmed beside a modest fire. His tale of Scrooge, of ghosts, of a second chance, had reshaped the holiday itself. It gave meaning to simple things. A shared pie, a holly branch tucked into the window. It wasn't about wealth, it was about togetherness. For the poor, celebration was harder, but never absent. On street corners, fiddlers played tunes that lingered in the air like a smile. Barrel organs rattled out carols, sometimes for coins, sometimes just to be heard. Markets stirred with the scent of roasting meats and sweet puddings. Families scraping together enough to make the holiday feel real. Children pressed their faces to shop windows, eyes wide at toys they'd never hold, their breath fogging the glass in wonder. Even the frozen outdoors offered escape. When the river thickened with ice, crowds formed to skate or cheer. Sometimes musicians played on frozen ponds. Performers took to street corners, drawing circles of warmth from their audience's laughter. Cheap theatres opened their doors to those with only a few pence, offering stories to hold in place of food. And in rooms where the fire barely flickered, neighbours huddled together, not just for warmth, but for company, for song, for the sound of someone else breathing beside them. In a city shaped by shadows, winter joy was not just entertainment, it was defiance. The wealthy held it in full measure, the poor took it in fragments. But sometimes those small pieces shone brightest, because in a time that tried to grind the soul down to cold and silence, every laugh, every note, every shared moment became something more. Not just survival of the body, but survival of the spirit. When winter gripped Victorian London in its hardest months, many turned not just to heat or food, but to faith. The city's churches, cloaked in fog and frost, became more than just places of worship. They became sanctuaries offering a warmth beyond fire, a kind of solace that wrapped around the soul when nothing else could. In the harshest cold, religion was not an idea, it was a refuge. On Sunday mornings, bells tolled across frozen rooftops, their sound muffled by the fog, but still steady, still strong. For the wealthy, church attendance was a social expectation. As much as it was spiritual, they arrived wrapped in furs, stepping from carriages into candle-lit pews warmed gently by fires. Organs played, voices rose, and sermons echoed through vaulted ceilings. The messages were often about morality, duty, generosity. The air was thick with incense and comfort. Faith here had the feel of pageantry, of order, but it also brought a quiet reassurance that beneath the wealth and ritual, the cold could be kept at bay through a higher power. For the poor, religion meant something more immediate. Many chapels were little more than stone shells, the wind sneaking through cracks, the candles burning low. But within those drafty walls, people found shelter, not just from the cold outside, but from the weight of despair. Ministers spoke of resilience, of salvation, not in this life, but the next. These sermons were not empty, they were lifelines. When the world offered nothing but hunger and dark, the promise of heaven became not just hope, but purpose. Something to cling to when there was nothing else. The church's role stretched beyond the pulpit. Charity and faith were deeply tied. During winter, churches organized soup lines, delivered blankets, handed out coal to those with nothing left. On Christmas Eve, the message of peace and goodwill translated into real actions, gifts of food, warm clothing, shoes for children. These gestures were not always enough, but they mattered. Religious societies and volunteers moved through the slums, offering both scripture and simple help. A few coins, a warm room for a night, or a prayer spoken over someone who had none left to say. Sunday schools gave children more than lessons. They gave them heat, stories, sometimes a meal. For many, these were the only classrooms they'd ever know. And in winter, a wooden bench by a stove was a blessing, as great as any passage from scripture. Still, the church was not perfect. Not every priest showed compassion. Some looked down on the poor, speaking more of laziness than suffering, more of sin than salvation. The line between moral teaching and judgment could grow thin. In those moments, religion stung more than it soothed. But even then, for thousands across the city, faith remained something sacred, a belief that the cold would pass, that pain had meaning, that endurance was grace. And in those rare and beautiful moments when choirs sang beneath candlelight, when carolers filled the streets, when hymns rose into the frost, faith felt like fire, not one you could see, but one you could feel, burning quietly inside. In Victorian London, death was never far, but in winter it pressed closer. The city, already burdened by poverty, became a place where mortality was not hidden. It was witnessed, daily, in the streets, the slums, and behind shuttered windows. Cold did not just chill the body, it ended it. Each morning, constables patrolled alleys and riverbanks, sometimes finding bodies curled beneath stairwells or pressed into corners where no fire had ever reached. Some were homeless, wrapped in little more than rags. Others were families who had tried to outlast the frost and failed. Death did not always come with drama. Often, it came quietly. A stillness mistaken for sleep. A silence no one disturbed until morning. The city's papers mentioned these deaths, often with polite detachment, but for most Londoners, they were not news. They were a grim rhythm of the season. In overcrowded tenements, disease took root in the damp. Illnesses that might have passed in warmer weather, pneumonia, influenza, tuberculosis, now settled in and stayed. Whole families fell ill. Babies, especially, were vulnerable. Poor mothers woke to find their infants lifeless beside them. The cold too much for bodies that had never known warmth. Grief was heavy, but survival left little room for mourning. Another shift waited. Another mouth still needed feeding. The workhouses, meant to protect, often became part of the toll. Meant as shelters, many were overcrowded, underheated, and dangerous. Old men collapsed from exhaustion. Women grew sick and never recovered, their deaths recorded in ledgers, their names fading beneath the ink of bureaucracy. No service, no ceremony, just another life lost to the season. Even in death, class divided the city. The wealthy held funerals beneath grey skies, the crunch of carriage wheels on frost following black horses, mourning clothes, flower arrangements, graves marked in stone. The poor buried loved ones in simple boxes, if they could afford them at all. Some took on debt for a coffin. Others relied on mass graves, nameless and unmarked. Potters' fields filled each winter with those who had simply run out of time. But death in this era wasn't always bleak. Strange as it seems, Victorians had a fascination with mourning. They took photographs of the dead, wore locks of their hair in pendants, wrote letters as if speaking to those lost. These rituals were not macabre. They were tender, proof that love didn't end at the grave. Still, for those living on the edge, winter's deaths were not wrapped in poetry. They were raw. The child lost meant one less bowl at the table, one less voice in the dark, but also a reminder death was close, closer than ever in the cold. And each passing wasn't just grief, it was a warning that the line between survival and silence was as thin as a single ember, that life in the city walked a narrow path, and winter waited at every turn. When winter settled in over Victorian London, sickness came with it. Cold air crept into lungs, damp clung to walls, and illness took hold wherever it could. But just like everything else in the city, access to healing was divided. The wealthy were tended in comfort, while the poor faced long lines, overcrowded wards and home remedies born out of desperation. In the coldest months, medical care wasn't just unequal, it was often a matter of who had the money to survive. For the upper classes, treatment came to them. Doctors arrived at the door in heavy coats, stepping into homes warmed by coal fires and cared for by staff. They carried polished leather bags filled with instruments and vials, their presence offering a sense of order and control. Patients lay beneath thick blankets, fed warm broths, and watched over by both physicians and nurses. Recovery was made easier with full meals, rest, and clean bedding. The medicine wasn't always effective by modern standards, but the comfort helped. And yet, even for the rich, winter was dangerous. Diseases like tuberculosis, influenza, and scarlet fever didn't respect wealth. They reached into parlors and drawing rooms, reminding even the privileged that the cold could not always be kept out. For the poor, illness was an entirely different battle. Hospitals, like Guy's or St. Thomas's, filled quickly each winter. Beds vanished. Patients were turned away, and those lucky enough to be admitted often found themselves packed into icy wards where disease passed from one bed to another like smoke. Nurses worked tirelessly, but there were never enough of them. Supplies ran thin, treatments were basic: laudanum for pain, mustard plasters for chests, cod liver oil for the weak. It wasn't healing, it was managing, holding off the worst, if only for a while. In the slums, where many never reached the hospital at all, families turned to remedies passed down through generations. Mothers wrapped onions in cloth to ease coughs. They smeared goose fat on children's chests, or brewed teas from whatever herbs they could find. Vinegar was used to clean wounds. Hot bricks, wrapped in rags, became makeshift heaters. Some of these helped. Many didn't. But in the absence of doctors, they were all that stood between a sick child and a long night. Charitable clinics and dispensaries offered small glimmers of help. A dose of medicine, a kind word, a warm place to sit. Missionaries brought both scriptures and bandages into the poorest corners of the city, hoping to treat the body and the soul. But the need always outpaced the resources. Epidemics swept through neighborhoods faster than any help could arrive. By the time someone came knocking, it was often too late. Even the doctors themselves were caught between what they knew and what they didn't. The science of germs was only beginning to take shape. Many still believed in bad air, or imbalances of the body's fluids. Treatments were often as harmful as the illness itself. Bloodletting, purging, and outdated tonics filled more prescriptions than modern hygiene or rest. Homes and hospitals alike were rarely ventilated. Sickness lingered in the very air people breathed, and few understood why. In the end, survival had less to do with medicine and more to do with luck. Whether a family had enough heat, enough food, enough strength to weather the storm. For the wealthy, healing was another service called for, paid for, and mostly expected. For the poor, it was a distant hope, something whispered over boiling herbs or prayed for in the middle of the night. And for many, that hope ran out before the frost did. In Victorian London, food was never just food. It was life, status, security. In the winter months, it became something even more urgent, a daily struggle for some, a seasonal indulgence for others. Nowhere was the divide between rich and poor more visible than on the table. In wealthy homes, the kitchens came alive in winter. Servants stocked pantries with salted meats, dried fruits and preserved goods. Fresh deliveries brought oysters, game birds, and imported delicacies. White bread, buttery pastries, rich puddings, all served in dining rooms glowing with warmth. Christmas meals became centerpieces of abundance. Roasted goose, brandied desserts, steaming vegetables and wines poured freely. These meals weren't just nourishment, they were performance. Evidence that cold and scarcity were things other people faced. But across town, food meant something different entirely. It meant survival. For the poor, bread was the foundation of nearly every meal. Coarse, sometimes moldy, sometimes mixed with fillers that made it heavy and hard. Potatoes offered what little bulk they could. Meat was rare, often it came in scraps, bones, trimmings, bits left over from someone else's feast. Broth was stretched thin, boiled with peels or bones, little more than warm water with flavor. Street food helped fill in the gaps. Roasted chestnuts, hot potatoes, jellied eels, cheap, hot and quick. But these meals were fleeting. They warmed the hands, filled the stomach for an hour or two, then left the hunger behind. Vendors lined alleys and market stalls, calling out to workers and children with pennies in their pockets. But even the cheapest bites added up, and many went without. The poorest scavenged. They searched through rubbish, begged at the back doors of bakeries, waited for spoiled produce to be tossed. Some families shared a single apple, some split a crust of bread, some didn't eat at all. Seasonal shortages made everything worse. Fresh vegetables were scarce, prices climbed. Even those who could scrape together money often found there was little to buy. And without coal, cooking became another challenge. Meals eaten cold, or not at all, became common. Malnutrition followed closely behind. Children's bellies swollen, faces pale, energy drained. Illness crept in faster when the body had no reserves to fight it. Churches and charities tried to help. Soup kitchens opened, bread lines formed. But there was never enough. People stood in freezing queues for hours, only to be turned away when the last ladle ran dry. For the children, hunger left deep marks. They grew up without knowing what it felt like to be full. A plum pudding at Christmas was a dream, an orange a miracle. For many, sleep came only from exhaustion, not satisfaction. Food in Victorian winter told a story louder than any speech. It told who had safety and who did not, who could afford warmth, and who burned scraps, who feasted, and who fasted, unwillingly. For the wealthy, every meal confirmed their place in the world. For the poor, every missed one reminded them how close they lived to the edge. In Victorian London, what you wore in winter wasn't about fashion, it was about survival. Clothing became armor, warmth, and identity, all at once. It protected the body, but also told the world who you were and who you weren't. In those frozen streets, fabric became a dividing line. For the wealthy, winter clothing was not only protective, it was elegant. Layers were custom-made, stitched to flatter and insulate. Men wore thick wool coats lined with velvet or fur, their collars high, their gloves snug against the skin. Underneath, waistcoats, cravats, crisp shirts. The look was polished, but it was practical too. Women wrapped themselves in heavy skirts and layered petticoats, cloaks and shawls draped from their shoulders, often trimmed in fur or silk. Bonnets and veils framed their faces. Their boots, high and leather-bound, kept out snow and damp. Even their accessories, muffs, parasols, gloves, served a purpose beyond appearance. They held the cold at bay. Their children were just as protected. Nannies ensured little boys were buttoned into woolen coats, ears covered, hands mittened. Girls wore thick dresses, boots that fit, scarves wrapped twice. No one stepped outside without preparation for them. Warmth was ensured. Not something to chase, but something waiting by the door. But for the poor, winter wear was a constant worry. There were no wardrobes, only what could be found, saved or patched. A coat might be passed down through siblings, worn thin, the lining barely holding. Layers came in the form of rags, old shawls, skirts over trousers, anything to slow the wind. Many children had no boots at all. Their feet wrapped in sacks or newspapers tied with string. Water soaked through within minutes. Gloves were rare. Hands turned red, then white, then numb. Frostbite came quietly. Toes blackened, fingers stiffened. Still, the work had to be done. Still, the streets had to be walked. Mothers stitched and restitched, trying to stretch a few scraps into something whole. Hats were made from remnants. Blankets became cloaks. Pride lived in the small things, keeping a shirt clean, a hem straight. Even in rags, there was dignity, a refusal to give in. But clothing wasn't just about comfort. It was about risk. Poorly dressed labourers were the first to fall ill. Exposure wasn't an abstract fear, it was immediate. A wet boot meant a chest infection. A drafty coat could end in pneumonia. Children who went out in the morning might come home coughing by night, or not come home at all. Still, people endured. Men wrapped ropes around their coats to hold them closed. Women wore two skirts and still shivered. Children clung to each other for warmth. A single scarf might be shared across a family, rotating between those who had to venture out. And yet, in every frayed sleeve and patched elbow, there was a quiet strength. Winter in the city didn't care what you wore, but how you wore it, how fiercely you held onto the little warmth you could find, told the story of survival more clearly than any fire ever could. No one felt the cruelty of winter more than the children. For them, the season wasn't snowball fights or cheerful songs. It was wind that cut like knives, streets that soaked their feet, hunger that followed them from dawn until sleep. Childhood in the cold was shaped by what you had, or didn't have, and the contrast was sharp. In wealthy homes, children lived in a kind of winter fairy tale. Snow covered their gardens in gentle blankets. They built snowmen in courtyards, skated on private ponds, always under the watchful eyes of nurses and governesses. Indoors, fires blazed, lessons were taught beside warm hearths, meals were regular, treats were plentiful. Christmas was a world of glittering ornaments, music, toys wrapped in paper and ribbon. For them, winter was cozy, magical, a season to be remembered fondly. But in the slums, childhood was something else entirely. Many children owned only a single set of clothes, thin and threadbare. Some had no shoes. Their bare feet slapped against frozen stones, or sloshed through slush in boots split open at the seams. They rose in the dark and worked through the light, selling matches, sweeping crossings, begging on corners, their hands chapped and cracked, their noses raw from the wind. School for most wasn't an option. Survival came first. Older siblings dragged younger ones through the streets. Some scavenged wood and coal, others waited outside bakeries hoping for discarded bread. Every coin mattered. Every warm corner was a blessing. Illness spread quickly. A cough in the morning could turn deadly by night. Many never saw a doctor. Mothers cradled babies beneath dripping ceilings, praying heat alone could keep them breathing. Often it couldn't. Infant death surged in winter. Whole families mourned quietly, grief drowned out by the need to keep going. The workhouse offered little peace. Children admitted with their parents were quickly separated, put to labor, picking oakum with bleeding fingers, scrubbing cold stone floors. The food was bland, the rules strict, the warmth minimal. Even when they were safe from the street, they weren't safe from hardship. And yet, they played, in alleyways and behind carts. Games unfolded. A rock became a toy. A song passed between friends. Laughter rang out, brief but real. Older children shared what little they had. They huddled together for warmth, for comfort, for love that didn't cost a coin. Winter carved its mark deep into their lives. It took their health, their innocence, sometimes their lives. But it also forged a kind of strength, the will to endure, to protect one another, to find joy even where there should have been none. For the fortunate, childhood was gilded with warmth and wonder. For the rest, it was trial by ice. And for every child, whether rich or poor, winter left something behind, a memory, a scar, or a story that would be carried for the rest of their lives. In the coldest months, when regular work vanished and food grew scarce, many of London's poor turned to the streets. There, among the fog and slush, they carved out fragile trades, small acts of survival, one sale at a time. Every corner, every alleyway became a marketplace, not of wealth, but of willpower. Street vendors were everywhere, their voices cut through the mist, calling out what little they had to offer. Roasted chestnuts, steaming and fragrant, were sold from iron pans that glowed like tiny beacons. Smoke curled upward as hands reached out, not just for food, but for warmth. Chestnuts cost pennies, but for a brief moment, they warmed the fingers, the face, the spirit. It wasn't much, but it helped. Hot baked potatoes were another winter staple. Vendors carried them in cloth-wrapped tins, shouting to passing crowds. Labourers stopped to press the heat to their palms, biting into soft flesh that filled the stomach, however briefly. A single potato could mean the difference between going cold and feeling human again, if only for a moment. Other trades were more fragile. Match girls wandered barefoot, their thin cries barely heard over the wind. Matches! Buy a box! They were young, always young, faces pale, hands trembling. The chemicals they carried left them sick. The cold left them weaker. But they had no choice. The only thing worse than walking the streets with matches was not walking them at all. Crossing sweepers stood near busy roads, clearing slush and grime with stiff brooms. For a coin they'd clear a path, hoping someone in fine boots would notice. Their backs ached, their clothes soaked, their pay uncertain, but they worked. Because work, even this, meant survival. Boys sold newspapers, shouting headlines into the fog, trying to sound louder than the wind. Others hawked ribbons, pins, small trinkets outside shops and theatres, their eyes scanning crowds for a kind face. Some families gathered bones or scrap metal, dragging bags behind them to trade for a few pennies. Coal spilled from delivery carts was snatched from the ground, a treasure not of gold but of warmth. Children, more than anyone, carried these trades. Their small hands, their pleading eyes, stirred pity. Mothers sent daughters to sell flowers, even wilted ones. Fathers taught sons to shine shoes, their hands red from cold water. In these streets, every trade told a story, not of enterprise, but of endurance. Competition was fierce. The earnings, small, and yet, these trades kept families alive. One box of matches, one scoop of nuts, one potato held in a freezing hand. That was all it took to turn one more day from impossible to barely possible. Winter on the streets of London wasn't just about money. It was about motion, about staying out long enough to sell, but not so long you froze, about pushing through pain, frostbite, exhaustion, because the fire at home wouldn't light itself, because there might not even be one. In the end, survival came down to these trades, small, simple, often unnoticed. But without them, the city's poor would have had no chance at all. Winter didn't give mercy, so they made their own. The Thames was more than a river. It was a lifeline, a boundary, a mirror of the city's mood. In summer, it carried goods, ideas, and people. But in winter, it changed. It slowed, hardened, became something to navigate carefully, or avoid altogether. It reflected the season in all its beauty, and all its danger. When the frost settled in, ice formed along the banks, sharp and jagged. The smaller branches froze completely. Barges struggled to move, caught in sluggish currents. Coal shipments slowed. Delays meant shortages, and shortages meant suffering. One frozen stretch of river could raise the price of coal city-wide, leaving thousands colder, hungrier, and more desperate. Fog was just as cruel. Thick, wet, suffocating. It rolled in without warning. Bridges disappeared. Lanterns turned to faint dots in the haze. Barges collided in silence. Cargo lost beneath the surface. Ferrymen rode blind, their passengers hunched and quiet, hoping to reach the far side without disaster. Even the river's sound changed, muted, distant, as though the cold had stolen its voice. Still, the Thames was more than obstacle. On rare winters when ice thickened just enough, it became a place of joy. Children dared to step onto the edge, skating or sliding, laughter ringing out across the water. Stalls sometimes sprang up on the ice, echoing the frost fairs of old, brief, magical moments when the river gave something back. But they never lasted. The ice cracked without warning. Lives were lost. Still, people returned, drawn to the idea that even this bitter season might hold wonder. For the poor, the river was a place of necessity. Children scavenged its edges for driftwood, bits of coal, anything they could burn. Ragpickers combed the banks for cloth, rope, metal things they could sell or use. It was resource and risk, all at once. But the river also held sorrow. Men fell from barges and didn't return. Children slipped from banks, vanished in seconds. Sometimes, the Thames became an escape, not for travel, but for those who had lost too much. Cold, hunger, grief. Some simply walked into the water when they could bear no more. The current took what the city had already worn down. And yet, the Thames was beautiful. In moonlight it shimmered. Fog curled across it like breath. Lanterns flickered on bridges. It moved, always, even when ice clung to its edges. Painters captured it. Poets tried to describe it. But for Londoners, rich and poor, it was part of life. It was the city's heartbeat. Slowed in winter, but never stopped. The Thames in winter was London itself. Choking, freezing, mourning, but also enduring. A silent witness to the city's quiet fight for survival, and a reminder that even in stillness, something always moved forward. In Victorian London, few places stirred fear and resentment like the workhouse. For the city's poor, it was both a last resort and a final barrier between life and death. In winter, its role became even more stark. The snow and frost pushed people to the brink, and many faced a choice: freeze on the streets, or give themselves over to a system that demanded everything but promised very little in return. The workhouse was built on a single idea: that help should never be easy. It was meant to discourage dependency, to ensure only the truly desperate would enter. And in winter, desperation was everywhere. Long lines formed outside iron gates. Men, women and children stood trembling, hoping to be allowed inside. Not all were. Some were turned away, told the rooms were full. They returned to the streets, where the wind showed no mercy. For those who were admitted, warmth was a relative term. Fires burned, yes, but not enough. Dormitories were cold, windows drafty, blankets thin. Families were separated immediately. Fathers in one wing, mothers in another, children in yet another. The emotional cost of that split, especially in the darkest months, was immeasurable. A mother might not see her child for days. A father might hear his son's cries through a wall and not be able to respond. Togetherness, the one thing that could offer comfort, was taken away the moment they stepped inside. Meals were basic. Gruel, bread, sometimes a scrap of meat. It kept people alive, but barely. For those who'd eaten nothing for days, it was a relief. But hunger never fully left, and there was no rest from labor. Men broke stones or hauled loads. Women scrubbed floors, laundered clothing in freezing water, stitched until their fingers bled. Children worked two small hands assigned to small tasks, but ones no less exhausting. The work was meant to be hard. It was meant to remind you that you were not there by choice. To be in the workhouse was to accept shame. Society saw you as failed, as weak. Even the act of seeking help was judged. Many held off as long as they could, clinging to whatever scraps of independence remained. Some chose to sleep in alleyways, to steal, even to starve, just to avoid walking through those doors. And yet, for many, the workhouse saved them. When winter bit hardest, when coal ran out, when sickness crept in, and food disappeared, the workhouse was the only place left. Its rules were cruel, its walls cold, but it was shelter. It was something. In the deepest parts of winter, the workhouse stood as a symbol of contradiction, protection and punishment, mercy and misery. It gave, but only after it had taken. Still, people entered, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice, and they endured, because that was what the winter demanded. When the cold swept across the city, and survival became uncertain, the line between right and wrong began to blur. For London's poorest, crime in winter wasn't about greed, it was about need. The laws didn't soften with the snow, but hunger made people bold, and the streets filled with the quiet desperation of those trying to make it through another day. Pickpockets thrived in winter. Thick coats and crowded markets gave them cover. Hands moved quickly, purses disappeared, pocket watches vanished in seconds. Children were often at the heart of these schemes, trained to slip through crowds, to grab and run before anyone noticed. For some families, a few stolen coins meant food, a few lifted goods meant heat. Burglary rose with the frost. Not for jewels or silver, but for bread, for coal, for a blanket. Thieves broke into homes, not to steal treasures, but to survive. Pantry raids, shed break-ins, back doors forced open to grab what someone else had, and they didn't. Even poor neighborhoods weren't safe from each other. Neighbors watched their own with suspicion. Everyone was hungry. Everyone was cold. And sometimes the hand that stole from you wore the same tattered coat as your own. Scams became common. People sold watered-down milk, meat that had spoiled, fabric sold as wool that was nothing but rags. Others posed as beggars, pretending to limp, feigning blindness, telling tragic stories to anyone who would stop and listen. It wasn't always honest, but it was often all they had left. Prostitution surged too. With no other income, women and even young girls took to the streets. Their eyes tired, their voices hoarse, their bodies wrapped in thin shawls. It was dangerous. It was heartbreaking. But for many it was the only way to buy food, to keep a child alive. Behind every glance, every whispered offer, was a story of someone pushed to the edge. Children, especially, were swept into this world. Some acted as lookouts, others ran messages, some became thieves themselves. Not because they were criminals, but because they were cold, because they were hungry, because they had no other path. Courts filled with cases. The prisons grew crowded, judges faced impossible choices. Should they punish the thief who stole bread for his siblings? Should they imprison a girl who sold herself for coal? The system leaned toward order. Most found little mercy, and so, winter crime became part of the city's rhythm. not driven by evil, but by exhaustion, not rebellion, but survival. Each theft a cry, each scam a plea. The city punished the desperate, even as it created their desperation. In the frozen streets of Victorian London, morality bent under the weight of frost and famine. People didn't choose to become criminals. They chose to live, however they could. In the frozen silence of Victorian London, warmth was everything. It wasn't a comfort, it was a battle. Fire meant more than flickering light, it meant life. And for those who had it, winter was bearable. For those who didn't, each night was a fight against the dark, against the cold, against the slow closing in of despair. For the wealthy, warmth was almost effortless. Their homes stood like islands of light, with fireplaces in nearly every room. Coal deliveries arrived regularly, stocked high in cellars and sheds. Servants rose early to stir embers back to life before anyone stirred. Parlours were ready by morning, beds warmed by night. Libraries glowed with steady flames. Breakfasts were served beside roaring hearths. The day began in comfort and ended the same way. For them, heat was always waiting. But across the city, behind crumbling walls and thin doors, the poor fought for every degree of warmth. Coal, the lifeblood of the Victorian hearth, was priced beyond reach for many in winter. Demand drove costs up, and even a single scuttle could consume what little money a family had. So they stretched it, burned slow, burned small, fires so weak they filled the room with smoke before they ever gave off heat. When coal couldn't be bought, it had to be found. Children scavenged riverbanks for driftwood, climbed through alleyways for scraps, watched coal carts for fallen pieces they could pocket without being seen. Some stole it, risking arrest just for a few moments of fire. Others broke apart furniture, chairs, shelves, anything that could be turned to ash. Inside those dark homes, the smell of smoke was thick, but the air remained cold. Fires were made of anything that would burn. Old clothes, broken crates, even rubbish. The smoke stung the eyes, blackened the ceilings, but it gave off just enough warmth to hold back the night. Families crowded around it, hands outstretched, shoulders touching, everyone close to feel just a little more. But with fire came danger. In tightly packed tenements, where walls were dry and space was scarce, one spark could mean catastrophe. A dropped ember, a blocked chimney, a gust through a cracked window. Entire buildings caught fire, and in minutes what little was owned was gone. What had kept them alive became what took everything away. Outside, things were no better. Street vendors used small open fires to keep their fingers from freezing. Cab drivers lit tin warmers filled with hot coals and tucked them near their feet. But those fires were fleeting. They offered no real protection, just a little comfort, just enough to keep moving. And still, fire was hope. Walking the streets at night, Londoners saw the city dotted with tiny points of light. Hearths behind thin curtains, lanterns hung on porches, even the glow of a pipe, briefly lit in the dark, offered reassurance that someone else was awake, that someone else was enduring too. In the poorest homes, a small fire could become a family's heart. People gathered close, shared stories, passed the time in whispers and silence. The warmth, though weak, drew them together. Not just physically, but emotionally. A moment of stillness, a memory made. For the wealthy, fire was an unspoken promise that winter could be endured in comfort. For the poor, it was a miracle conjured from nothing. A flicker pulled from scraps. A gift stolen from the cold. It was fragile. It was fought for. And in many homes, it was all they had. In the end, the battle for heat wasn't just about coal or wood or fire. It was about surviving a season that tried to take more than just warmth. It tried to take dignity, spirit, hope. But as long as even the smallest flame could be lit, there was something left to hold on to. Dances, banquets, and charitable galas shaped the season for the elite, filling their calendars with events of elegance and indulgence, while frost glazed the streets of London in icy stillness. Inside grand halls, chandeliers glittered above swirling dancers, and violins played melodies that drowned out the winter winds. For the wealthy, winter shimmered like crystal, a season of pleasure wrapped in tradition. Yet for the working classes, joy took simpler but no less meaningful forms. The public house stood at the center of winter's social life. Taverns offered a haven, a place where warmth, food, and company melted the chill. The smoky air buzzed with laughter, rowdy songs, and the clinking of mugs. A single coin could grant entry to music halls, where bawdy tunes rang out, acrobats flipped across the stage, and comedians delivered punchlines that made the crowds erupt with laughter. These spaces were loud, packed, and brimming with energy. For labourers, they were a few precious hours of forgetting the cold. Street performers braved the icy air too. Punch and Judy puppeteers, fiddlers, and jugglers entertained wrapped-up crowds who tossed coins in thanks. Children huddled in alleys, fogged with their own breath, mesmerized by fire-eaters and street magicians, their eyes shining despite the cold that crept through their worn shoes. And above all, the winter holidays brought a flicker of light to every home. Christmas in Victorian London grew more vibrant each year, with carols in the air, decorations in windows, and old traditions reborn. Even families with almost nothing found ways to celebrate a shared pudding, a bit of holly pinned to the wall, or a single flickering candle placed with care. A small toy, a handmade doll, or a bright orange in a child's stocking could ignite pure delight. But joy, like everything else, bore the marks of division. While the rich attended theatres and orchestras, the poor gathered in taverns and streets. Still, both groups chased the same thing, a brief escape from winter's grip. Whether basking in the golden glow of an opera house, or stomping their feet in a packed music hall, Londoners sought warmth, not just for the body, but for the spirit. Winter's entertainment wasn't merely for amusement, it was resistance. Through laughter, song, and shared wonder, Victorians carved out moments of humanity from a season that showed little mercy. As icy winds screamed through crooked streets and frost drew patterns on the glass of dimly lit homes, many Londoners turned inward, toward faith, toward the promise of something beyond survival. In winter, religion took on a deeper meaning. Churches weren't just places for prayer, they were sanctuaries, warm, lit, and open. In the coldest months, they became the heart of community life. Bells echoed through the frozen city on Sunday mornings, their chimes ringing through snow and smoke. Wealthy families arrived in carriages, wrapped in wool and fur, their shoes shined, their children scrubbed and silent. Poorer congregants came on foot, walking miles across frozen streets, gripping one another's hands for warmth. Yet inside, the division faded, at least for a time. Hymns rose from every voice, banker and beggar alike, defiant against the bitter chill. For the upper classes, winter religion upheld a sense of order. After services, they mingled in parlours and drawing rooms, sipping warm drinks and discussing charitable causes. Donations were made, sometimes out of duty, sometimes out of kindness. These funds kept soup kitchens running, coal baskets full, and charity efforts alive in the worst weather. But for the poor, religion was something more urgent. It was shelter. It was bread, blankets, and a hot meal. Churches provided not just sermons, but a lifeline. Missionaries walked into the darkest corners of the city, delivering both scripture and sustenance. For some families, a church door was the only one that opened, and faith, however fragile, was the only thing that held back despair. Winter festivals like Christmas deepened this connection. While decorations and commerce flourished in shops and mansions, carolers still sang in alleyways, voices ringing with hope. Candlelit services drew people together. Flickering flames glowed in chapels and cathedrals alike, casting shadows that danced like spirits, symbols of light clinging to life amid darkness. Poor children who had nothing else found joy in nativity plays or gifts from church charities. A biscuit, a scarf, a simple toy. The differences between wealthy cathedrals and cramped chapels were obvious. Yet the yearning was the same, a shared longing for warmth, meaning, and something to hold on to. In winter, sermons sharpened, hymns carried more weight. Religion didn't erase hunger or bring warmth to every room, but it gave people the strength to face another day. In churches thick with candle smoke and the scent of damp wool, people found not just shelter, but solidarity, faith. In those months was not about rules, it was a promise, a reminder that even in the coldest moments, light still lived in belief, in kindness, and in the simple act of gathering together. As winter tightened its grip, and cold crept through the bricks and bones of London, something else rose alongside the suffering, the spirit of giving. In those months, when hunger and illness hovered like smoke in the air, charity became a matter of life or death. Nowhere was the divide between rich and poor more glaring than in winter, and nowhere was the need for kindness more urgent. For the wealthy, giving became a seasonal ritual, tied to both religion and reputation. Charity wasn't just generosity, it was seen as duty. Well-to-do families contributed to relief funds, coal drives, and soup kitchens. Newspapers printed calls for donations, and names were noted. A public act of giving might raise a person's social standing, but for those receiving, it meant food on the table, heat in the hearth, and survival. Soup kitchens became sanctuaries. Run by churches, missions, or private donors, they ladled hot broth and bread into cold hands. The lines stretched down icy streets, mothers cradling babies, men too tired to speak, children with hollow eyes. Coal was life. Philanthropists bought it by the ton and handed out sacks to families in the slums. A single bucket might only last a day, but in that time, it meant warmth. It meant steam rising from soaked boots and cold fingers coming back to life. Blankets, too, donated from manor homes, were passed from house to house, fraying, stained, but precious beyond measure. Charitable societies expanded their reach. Ragged schools offered more than education. They gave meals, clothing, and safety. Orphanages took in children left behind. Christmas charities focused on bringing smiles to young faces, even if it was just one small toy, a story, or a slice of pudding. But philanthropy wasn't simple. Many benefactors insisted on rules, sobriety, church attendance, or moral conduct in exchange for aid. Every act of generosity came with a reminder of one's place in society. The poor often accepted it, not because they agreed, but because hunger leaves little room for pride. Still, the strongest thread wasn't always from the top down. In cramped alleys and overcrowded rooms, neighbors shared scraps, pooled coins, and watched over one another. A cup of soup passed through a window, a child taken in by a neighbor. These were the acts that truly stitched the city together. Charity in winter was more than handouts. It was a bridge. Fragile, imperfect, but essential. For one moment, it brought classes closer. It reminded the city that survival wasn't only about wealth, but about humanity. And though no donation could erase the weight of winter, every act of giving, every coal scuttle, every ladle of soup lit a tiny flame in the cold, keeping despair at bay just a little longer. Winter in Victorian London didn't just bring cold, it brought death. The chill wasn't just in the air, it was in the lungs, in the bones, in the very walls of the city. Illness spread like smoke through crowded homes and filthy streets, touching every class but hitting the poor with a cruelty that felt almost deliberate. The cold weakened bodies, already worn thin. Damp rooms and unwashed bedding were breeding grounds for disease. Entire families shared one room, breathing the same stale, smoky air, while frost clung to the inside of windows. In homes without fires, sickness moved in without resistance. Respiratory illnesses ruled the season. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis, known then as consumption, spread quickly in the slums. A cough could turn fatal in a matter of days. The smoke from coal fires meant to bring warmth only worsened the damage, leaving lungs raw and breath shallow. Children were the most vulnerable. Thin, hungry, underdressed. They stood no chance. Influenza came in waves, sweeping through neighborhoods, sparing few. The rich caught it too, but their recovery happened in warm beds, with doctors summoned and medicine at hand. The poor had no such refuge. A sick laborer lost not just his health, but his wages. Families starved as their providers lay in dark corners, coughing themselves into silence. And when medicine could be bought, it was often useless. Bottles labeled as cures were mostly alcohol, opium, or colored water. Tonics promised relief, but delivered only numbness. Real care, if it came at all, arrived too late. Diseases like cholera and typhus, though more common in warmer months, also haunted winter. When pipes froze and burst, people turned to unsafe water sources. Sanitation collapsed, filth gathered in alleys and yards, and death crept in behind it. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed lives in quiet ways. The homeless were found stiff and still under bridges or curled near market stalls. Even those with homes sometimes slipped away in their sleep, when the fire went out and blankets were too thin. Coroners' ledgers filled with the same cold verdict: exposure, illness, starvation. Funerals increased. Graves were dug faster. For the poor, burials were often shared, with no stone to mark the name, just frozen ground and fading footprints. But even against all this, people tried. Mothers brewed herbal teas. Neighbors checked on one another. Churches sent missionaries to the sick with bread and blankets in hand. Still, winter didn't care. The cold pressed in, squeezing breath from lungs and hope from hearts. For many, illness was not a misfortune. It was a certainty, and death walked the streets like a regular guest, known by name, expected at any moment. In the shadowed corners of London, where warmth was rare and rest was a luxury, surviving the winter wasn't a given, it was a battle. In Victorian London, death was never far, but in winter it came more often and stayed longer. The season turned mourning into a daily rhythm. Frost sharpened grief, and the rituals of loss took on a colder weight. For the wealthy, mourning followed strict codes. When a loved one died, the home was cloaked in black, curtains drawn, mirrors covered, servants dressed in dark uniforms. Winter only amplified this somberness. Black veils billowed in the wind, and funeral processions moved through snow-covered streets with quiet ceremony. Horse-drawn carriages, draped in mourning cloth, rolled past rows of onlookers. At the graveside, wreaths of holly and evergreen were laid gently on the frozen earth, symbols of life that refused to die, even in winter. But for the poor, mourning was stripped bare. Grief came not with ceremony, but with silence. Families unable to pay for burial turned to public plots. Frozen ground made graves harder to dig and costlier. Bodies were sometimes kept in cold rooms, waiting for funds or for the earth to soften enough to receive them. Without burial clubs, small groups that pooled money for funerals, many faced the cruel option of a pauper's grave. No name, no headstone, just earth and frost. Coffins were carted over icy streets. Pallbearers slipped on stone steps. Some families waited days to bury their dead, praying they could gather enough to avoid the shame of a shared, anonymous burial. In wealthier homes, embalming or preservation was possible. Ice chambers kept the dead until all was prepared. But for the rest, time and temperature did the work, turning bodies stiff while families wept nearby. Mourning clothing was not just tradition, it was necessity. Heavy fabrics warded off the chill, as much as they marked loss. Widows trudged through snow to churchyards in layered black, their hands raw from the cold. Children walked barefoot behind small coffins, tears freezing on their cheeks, their grief mingling with the numbness in their limbs. Even holidays brought sorrow. Christmas, for all its cheer, sharpened the pain for families with empty chairs at the table. Carols meant to inspire warmth, instead echoed hollow in homes touched by recent loss. Still, the poor found ways to mark death with dignity. A sprig of holly laid near a body, a borrowed black ribbon, a single candle burning beside the bed. These small acts carried meaning, proof that love endured even when money failed. In the graveyards of winter, the divide between rich and poor was clear, but so was the common truth. Death came for all, and in the frost both wealth and poverty stood still, heads bowed, hearts heavy. Winter funerals were not just farewells, they were acts of defiance, a promise that life, even when ended, would not be forgotten. In the frozen streets of Victorian London, women carried the heaviest burdens, whether in crumbling tenements or stately homes. Winter asked more from them, more labour, more sacrifice, more endurance. And somehow, they gave it. For working-class women, survival began at dawn, if not before. Fires had to be lit, if fuel could be found. Water hauled from public pumps, often frozen or icy. Meals prepared from whatever scraps were available, stretched and seasoned with nothing but care. They rationed coal down to crumbs, patched clothes again and again, used old newspapers as insulation in boots and coats. Mothers went without meals, so their children could eat. The cold didn't ask for pity, and neither did they. Laundry, already a brutal task, became punishment in winter. Women scrubbed clothes in water that burned their skin with cold. Garments hung stiff as boards, freezing solid on the lines. When drying indoors, the damp worsened illness, but there was no other way. Many women also worked outside the home. Seamstresses, laundresses, or market sellers, standing in the frost for hours, hawking matches, ribbons, or fruit, wrapped in shawls, hands blue with cold. Some worked with children clinging to their skirts. For widows and single mothers, it was the only option. Work or perish. In wealthier homes, the challenges were different, but still present. Ladies oversaw large households, managing servants, and ensuring fires were kept lit in every room. Winter meant charity drives, sewing circles for the poor, and overseeing holiday feasts, comforted by wealth, perhaps, but not untouched by duty. They were expected to be both hostesses and moral guides. Yet, the greatest weight fell on those with the least. Some women, with no options left, turned to the streets. Prostitution surged in winter, not out of desire but desperation. A night's work meant a meal, a bed, or a blanket. Many were young, too many were children. Others endured abusive marriages, trapped by poverty and fear. To leave meant risking hunger, homelessness, or worse. Survival demanded silence. And yet, through it all, women endured. They were the first to rise, tending fires before daylight, the last to sleep, mending clothes by candlelight. They comforted the sick, buried the dead, and fed their families on nothing but willpower. They held the home together when everything else cracked beneath the ice. In truth, it was not the wages of men that saw families through the winter, it was the invisible labor of women. Society didn't see it, but winter revealed it. They weren't just caretakers, they were warriors. Quiet fighters against the cold, against hunger, against despair, and without them, the frost would have claimed far more than it did. No group felt the sting of winter in Victorian London more painfully than children. Their small bodies, already fragile from poor nutrition and hard labor, had little defense against the season's cruelty. For many, the frost wasn't just cold, it was a threat they faced every hour. The children of the poor knew little comfort. Their coats were thin, patched over and over. Many had no shoes, their bare feet turning red and raw against the icy ground. Parents, already stretched to the edge, gave what they could: an extra layer, a shared blanket, a crust of bread. But most days, it wasn't enough. Work didn't stop because the streets were frozen. Boys delivered papers, sold matches, swept crossings, or ran errands. Girls worked as assistants, carried baskets through sleet, or sold flowers on corners. Their fingers stiff with cold, their eyes sunken from hunger. They earned pennies, and those pennies kept their families alive. The cost was heavy. Frostbitten toes, hacking coughs, and exhaustion followed them through fog and slush. Some collapsed, others simply disappeared into the city's shadows. Orphans faced even darker prospects. With no home to return to, they curled up under bridges or in abandoned corners of the market. Some found warmth in gangs, groups of children who survived through theft, begging, or luck. Others stared with hollow eyes at passers-by, their hands out hoping for a coin, a crust, anything. And yet, in the bleakest corners, children still found moments of joy. When snow fell, rare though it was, it transformed the streets. Boys rolled snowballs and skated on frozen puddles. Girls laughed as they caught snowflakes on their tongues. These moments, however brief, sparkled against the grey. They were not just distractions, they were defiance. Charities worked hardest during this season to help them. Ragged schools provided not just lessons, but warmth and food. Missions handed out coats, boots, and scarves. At Christmas, donations meant hot meals, toys, and a taste of wonder. A single orange, a wooden doll, a small book. These gifts mattered. But even with help, the season claimed many. Illness moved fast, taking the smallest and weakest first. Hospitals filled, graveyards filled faster. Most of these deaths passed without notice, without ceremony. Just another child, gone. Yet, the children of Victorian London were more than victims. They were survivors. They laughed in alleys, ran through fog, and clung to hope with fierce hearts. Their struggle revealed the raw edge of the city's inequality. But their joy when it came was pure. Even in the darkest winter, the light of childhood refused to die. Winter changed the way London ate. The cold didn't just creep into homes. It reached kitchens, tables, and stomachs. What a family ate in the harsh months told you everything about where they stood in society. For the wealthy, The season was a feast. Tables overflowed with roasted meats, beef, turkey, goose, venison. Platters gleamed with sauces and sides. Imported fruits, grapes, pineapples, oranges were served with pride. Christmas became a centerpiece of excess. Steaming puddings soaked in brandy, rich cakes dense with fruit and spice, wine poured freely. For the upper class, winter was not a time of want. It was a time to indulge. The middle class had less extravagance, but no shortage. Stews and roasts made from more modest cuts, filled plates. Root vegetables, preserves and pickles, stored from autumn, carried families through. Bread, butter, cheese, and strong tea were daily comforts. Their diet was hearty, dependable, and carefully managed. But for the poor, food was survival, and nothing more. Bread was the backbone of every meal. Some added drippings or a spoonful of cheap jam. But meat was rare, a bone for broth, if they could afford it. Potatoes and onions added bulk when they were in reach. Many meals were no more than watery soups, eaten quickly before the fire went out. Street food offered quick relief. Vendors sold hot pies, contents unknown, roasted chestnuts, baked potatoes, and mugs of wheat coffee. A few pennies bought warmth, even if the food barely nourished. Malnutrition wore away at families. Children grew thin, their growth stunted. Mothers gave up their own portions so little ones could eat. Hunger was a constant ache, made worse by the cold that demanded calories the body couldn't find. Charities stepped in where they could. Soup kitchens served thousands thin broth, bread rolls, maybe a slice of meat at Christmas. Some families clung to these handouts as their only source of nutrition. And still, the divide stood stark. The smell of roasting meat from taverns drifted past children chewing stale crusts. Behind glowing windows, tables gleamed with silver, while across the street, someone boiled cabbage water for dinner. Christmas gave the poor one rare moment. Donated meals, beef, pudding, bread, were served in churches and halls. For many it was the only full meal they'd see that month. A reminder that joy and dignity could still be tasted, even for a night. Winter diets told the truth. For the rich, food was comfort, celebration, identity. For the poor, it was struggle. And still, in every home, food meant something more than sustenance. It meant hope, or the lack of it. When frost settled over London's rooftops and fog swallowed its streets, many reached for a drink, not to celebrate, but to endure. In winter, alcohol was more than a pleasure. It was a refuge, a false warmth in a world that offered little real comfort. Among the poor, gin was king. Cheap, potent, and easy to find. Taverns poured it in smoky rooms where the air buzzed with voices and firelight. For a few pennies, a labourer could feel the sting of something warm in his chest. Women drank too, sometimes to dull hunger, sometimes to numb sorrow. Taverns in winter swelled with people seeking light and heat, the walls echoing with laughter and slurred songs. But the warmth was fleeting. Gin didn't fill a belly or fix a broken roof. It blurred the hunger, not the need. For many, it deepened misery rather than easing it. Beer and ale were more common and more accepted. Safer than water, they were part of everyday life. Workers ended the day with pints, while even children drank watered-down small beer at home. Alehouses in winter became gathering places, warmth shared as much in company as in drink. For the middle and upper classes, alcohol wore a different face. Mulled wine and spiced cider scented holiday gatherings. Brandy and rum graced Christmas tables, soaked into puddings or sipped by the fire. Port and sherry followed dinners, while gentlemen retreated to smoking rooms with whiskey and cigars. Here, drink was ritual, not escape. A sign of refinement, not desperation. Yet even in these homes, the glass sometimes masked grief, widows raising brandy to absent husbands, or lonely elders, sipping through the long dark nights. Across classes, alcohol connected people, but it also exposed them. Drunkenness surged in the cold months. Fights, thefts, and domestic violence rose with every drink. Reformers and temperance leaders saw it as a moral failure, a poison draining the soul of the city. Pamphlets warned of gin shops where wages vanished and families starved. Campaigns cried out that drink ruined lives. And yet, for many, to deny drink was to deny their only escape. A mug of ale, a nip of gin, a shared pint. It was the one comfort they could afford. In the end, alcohol in winter was a paradox. It brought laughter and sorrow, warmth and ruin. It was a crutch, a tradition, a curse, and a balm. Just like London itself, it offered everything and cost more than most could bear. Few words in Victorian London carried more weight than workhouse. It was a place spoken of in fear, a last resort for those who had lost everything, designed under the poor law to offer relief. Workhouses were meant to deter as much as to help, and in winter, when hunger sharpened and streets turned deadly, these cold institutions filled quickly. As snow fell and winds stiffened, the queues outside workhouses grew longer. Families who had barely managed through warmer months now found themselves with no firewood, no wages, and no mothers holding infants, elderly widows, and jobless men stood waiting, breath rising in pale clouds, praying the doors would open. For many it was a brutal choice: enter the workhouse or freeze. Inside, the rules were strict. Families were separated, husbands from wives, parents from children, each sent to different wards. The bonds that held people together were broken by design. Comfort, even the comfort of one another, was considered a luxury. Men were sent to hard labor, breaking stones, picking oakum, pushing themselves to the edge. Women washed laundry or sewed until their fingers cracked, often in rooms nearly as cold as the streets they had left behind. Children worked too, assigned endless tasks with no kindness, no pause. The food was sparse. Gruel, bread, and watery soup formed the daily meals. Meat was rare, warmth rarer, dormitories were cold, the fires too small, the blankets too few. Many lay awake at night, teeth chattering, listening to coughing echo through the halls. Still, the workhouse offered what the streets could not: a roof, meals, and the barest chance at survival. For children, there was sometimes schooling. For the elderly, a reprieve from the risk of dying alone. But the cost was steep. The shame of entering a workhouse lingered. Society viewed it as a mark of failure. Even those who left carried that mark with them. And winter only sharpened the cruelty. The cold outside mirrored the cold within. The walls kept out the wind, but not the despair. Workhouses reminded the poor that survival came with a price, and that charity often wore the face of punishment. In the heart of London's winter, the workhouse stood like a warning. If you fall too far, this is all that waits. If the workhouse was feared, prison was dreaded. In Victorian London, prisons were built, not just to confine, but to break down. Punishment came in silence, isolation, and relentless discipline. In winter, those punishments deepened. The season itself became part of the sentence. Stone walls absorbed the cold, holding it like a secret. Cells were small, unheated, and damp. Inmates slept on narrow beds with thin blankets, the breath visible in the air. Frost bloomed on the inside of barred windows. Rats and lice thrived in the chill. Sickness spread easily. Coughs echoed down long corridors, and no extra food or warmth was given. Winter didn't slow the work, it only made it harder. Prisoners broke stones in icy yards, their hands raw from cold. Others hauled loads or turned heavy cranks in the sleet, muscles aching, clothes soaked. Uniforms were thin, offering little protection. When snow fell, it mixed with mud, turning labor yards into dangerous, freezing pits. Solitary confinement, meant to reform, became torture in winter. Alone in the cold, with only the sound of wind outside, many sank into despair. The dark felt endless. Hope receded. Minds unraveled in the silence. Guards, cold themselves, offered no comfort. Rules were followed. Mercy was not part of the system. Even so, some prisons offered small relief. A few had stoves or thicker clothing. Newer buildings tried to mitigate the worst of winter, but in older, overcrowded jails, nothing helped. Diseases like pneumonia, flu, and tuberculosis took inmates swiftly. Weak from poor rations and hard labor, many didn't survive the season. Holidays like Christmas passed with little notice. A simple chapel service, maybe an extra piece of bread. Outside, families gathered for warmth and food. Inside, the day passed like any other, cold, grey, and endless. To society, prison's harshness was a lesson. Suffering meant justice. To families with loved ones locked away, Winter added another layer of grief. Letters were few, visits rarer still. For prisoners, winter was a second sentence, one not written in law, but carved into bone. They counted the days, not just to freedom, but to thaw, when the frost left the walls, when the wind stopped cutting like a blade. Until then, survival meant endurance. And hope, when it came slow. While the poor fought for warmth and food, London's aristocracy turned winter into a season of splendor. Behind the stone facades of Mayfair and Belgravia, cold became aesthetic, something to admire from inside rooms glowing with firelight and candle warmth. Wealth shielded the upper class from winter's bite. Coal burned steadily in every hearth. Heavy drapes kept out the draughts. Thick carpets cushioned steps. Frost on windows was not a threat, it was decoration. Winter fashion became an art. Ladies wore velvet gowns trimmed with fur, their hands hidden in muffs, faces framed by elaborate hats. Men stepped out in greatcoats, gloves and canes, projecting elegance even in the cold. Tailors and dressmakers thrived, busy meeting seasonal demands. The social calendar came alive. Balls, dinners, and opera nights filled the evenings. Theatres sparkled with gaslight as orchestras played and chandeliers gleamed. These weren't just gatherings, they were displays of wealth, power, and polish. To be seen was as important as to attend. Winter was an opportunity to rise in society's ranks. A dance, a dinner, a conversation could shift fortune. Outdoor leisure had its place too. Carriage rides through snow-dusted parks became romantic outings. Some families escaped to countryside estates where frozen ponds hosted skating parties and hunts carried on through crisp white fields. Christmas stood at the center of aristocratic winter. Imported trees glittered with candles and ornaments. Gifts were lavish. Jewelry, books, toys, tables sagged under the weight of roasts, fruits and puddings soaked in brandy. And beyond the feasting came the performance of giving. Many aristocrats organized charity events, coal drives, food distributions or donations to orphanages. While these acts helped many, they also reinforced power. The giver was praised, the receiver reminded of their place. Philanthropy became fashionable. A way to be seen as generous, even as one returned to a home with 10 fires burning and 12 servants standing by. For the aristocracy, winter wasn't endured, it was enjoyed. The season was painted in gold and silver, where hardship became distant and beautiful. But behind the frost-kissed windows, the contrast was sharp. Across the city, another child froze. Another mother rationed coal. Winter was a mirror, and the reflections it offered were vastly different, depending on which side of the glass you stood. As winter settled over Victorian London, illness followed close behind. Streets darkened by fog became paths for fever, and every cough echoed louder in the cold. Medicine, in that era, was a battlefield, caught between old beliefs, new discoveries, and outright deception. Doctors debated everything. Some clung to the miasma theory, believing disease floated in foul air, thick with smoke and sewage. Others began leaning toward new ideas like germ theory, whispered across Europe by scientists like Louis Pasteur. But London changed slowly, and in the slums, the difference between science and superstition often blurred. Treatment varied wildly. Some doctors still prescribed bleeding, leeches, or purging. Others offered cod liver oil, mustard poultices, and quinine. For fevers, the remedy was often cold compresses and prayers. For coughs, herbal brews or camphor rubs. In wealthier homes, doctors arrived in polished boots, bringing reassurance along with bottles. Their patients rested beneath warm blankets, sipping hot broths. Recovery was expected. For the poor, medicine looked different. Hospitals overflowed in winter. St. Bartholomew's, the London Hospital, and charity wards struggled to keep up. Beds were scarce, and many were turned away. Those admitted often shared cramped spaces where infection spread faster than help. And outside the hospitals, quacks flourished. Patent medicine sellers lined the streets, hawking miracle elixirs. Bottles promised to cure consumption, clear coughs, and strengthen the lungs. Labels boasted grand names. Inside, alcohol, opium, or water dyed red. Families desperate to help sick children spent hard-earned pennies on hope in a bottle. Newspaper ads told tales of miraculous recoveries. Most were lies. Public health reformers saw the pattern. They pushed for cleaner water, better housing, and working sewers. Knowing illness thrived in damp, overcrowded rooms. But change came slowly, and each winter brought fresh reminders of what hadn't been fixed. For many, home remedies remained the only option. Mothers brewed teas from herbs. Steam from boiling pots eased chests. Blankets were piled high. Some placed warm bricks at the foot of the bed, hoping it would chase the chill away. Faith too had its place in healing. Churches urged prayer. Pamphlets encouraged hygiene. But when fevers rose, most families didn't call a doctor. They did what they could and hoped the worst would pass. Winter medicine in Victorian London was a maze. Between real science, blind faith, and clever lies, families searched for something, anything that worked. And often, what truly made the difference wasn't medicine at all. It was luck, endurance, and the hope that spring would come before the sickness took hold. In the deepest stretch of winter, when hunger gnawed and illness spread unchecked, many Londoners turned to something beyond the physical, to belief, to ritual, to faith. Religion in winter was more than ceremony. It was structure. It was solace. Churches and chapels dotted the city, their bells piercing fog and frost like a reminder someone still watched, someone still cared. For the poor, these buildings offered more than prayer. Mission halls served soup, handed out blankets, and welcomed weary souls. Sermons were wrapped in messages of perseverance. Faith was painted as a test. Survive the cold, hold on, and salvation would follow. In the poorest corners of the city, church pews provided more warmth than any home. Men and women who had nowhere else to go sat shoulder to shoulder beneath stained glass and smoke-darkened beams, singing hymns as if their lives depended on it. At Christmas, this comfort expanded. Wealthier families filled candlelit cathedrals, dressed in fur and silk. Choirs sang carols that echoed against stone walls. Trees glittered with ornaments. For them, religion was celebration. Grand, ordered, beautiful. For the poor, Christmas was the one day when help came unasked. Churches became places of joy. Toy drives, food baskets, and warm meals turned holy spaces into havens of human kindness. Children lined up for oranges and wooden toys. Families shared slices of pudding and whispered thank yous through tears. In those moments, the gap between rich and poor narrowed, not erased but softened. Winter sermons carried a different weight. Preachers spoke of light in darkness, of warmth in the cold. The season became metaphor, a city frozen in body, but not in spirit. Middle and upper classes saw church as moral duty. Regular attendance proved character. Donations were social currency, used to display compassion. But the poor came out of need, not for reputation, but for survival. Religious symbolism ran through the season. Evergreens, candles, and nativity scenes filled homes and chapels. In them, people found comfort, evidence that even when the earth lay dead under frost, something waited to bloom again. Yet, even in this sanctuary, questions grew. Some asked, how a just God allowed so much suffering? Reformers and radicals pushed harder, arguing that faith without action was hollow. That religion must stand against poverty, not just preach endurance. Still, for many, faith endured. Not because it erased hardship, but because it gave hardship meaning. In unheated chapels, under flickering candlelight, people found peace. They sang, they prayed, and they believed. And for a few hours the cold outside felt a little further away. When the sun dipped behind soot-stained rooftops and the day surrendered to shadow, winter nights in London changed the city entirely. What had been grim by day became strange by night. Alive, yes, but dangerous. Darkness fell early, often before work had ended. Fog pressed in with the cold thick as soup, swallowing streets and smothering lampposts. Gaslight flickered against the mist, casting halos that distorted every movement. Shapes loomed, then vanished. To walk at night was to walk into uncertainty. Horse-drawn carriages rattled past, their drivers calling out to avoid collisions. Street vendors lit lanterns and cried their wares. Chestnuts, potatoes, weak coffee, steam curled from carts, coins clinked. Children still worked, selling matches, shouting headlines. Their voices cracked the silence like frost underfoot. For them, night was just more time to earn. But as the lamps glowed dimly and the crowds shifted, the city showed its darker side. Pickpockets moved like ghosts, slipping through heavy coats and distracted hands. Prostitutes, some no more than girls, leaned from shadows, calling softly to passers-by. Taverns spilled drinkers into the streets, some laughing, others ready to fight. The police patrolled with batons and lanterns, but the maze of alleyways gave cover to anyone who knew how to vanish. For the homeless, night brought its own torment. Doorways became beds, market stalls became shelters. Sleep, when it came, was thin and dangerous. The cold didn't knock, it crept in slowly, numbing fingers, slowing breath. Many never woke, and yet, even in the danger, there was beauty. Gas lamps reflected on wet cobblestones like rivers of gold. Church bells tolled in the distance, solemn and steady. In certain moments the city felt dreamlike, half real, half phantom, a world made of whispers and fog. Artists and writers wandered these streets, drawn to the eerie wonder. These nights inspired novels, sketches, and tales of horror and mystery. London, after dark, became legend. But for the poor, the night wasn't a poem. It was a trial. Each hour survived was a quiet victory. In winter, London never truly slept. It breathed in the shadows, moved in the mist. And those who walked its streets after sunset knew the truth. There was magic in the night, but it came with teeth. Gas lamps hissed to life as the last of the day's light vanished. In winter, the city depended on them, but their glow was soft, uncertain. Fog absorbed the light like ink soaking into paper. The haze distorted everything, faces, footsteps, even the sound of voices. Shapes stretched and flickered. Figures seemed to float. London became a city of silhouettes and guesses. This was the world of the pea souper. A fog so thick that you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Carriages slowed to a crawl. Drivers calling out to avoid collisions. Pedestrians moved with arms outstretched, hoping not to disappear into traffic or vanish into alleys. The glow of lamps turned ghostly, more illusion than guidance. For the wealthy, gaslight meant the evening continued. Dinners, concerts, late strolls under flickering halos. But for the poor, it extended danger. Night work went on. Street vendors shouted into the dark. Thieves lurked in shadows that barely moved. The mist gave cover to everyone, from starving beggars to seasoned criminals. To the city's reformers, gaslight was modernity, proof that London was advancing. But for those who lived in the narrow lanes and behind broken windows, it was just another trick of the cold. The lights glowed, yes, but they did not warm. They did not feed. They did not promise safety. In winter, light and shadow lived together, and sometimes it was hard to tell which one was which. When the air turned to ice and the fog clung close, London streets turned colder in more ways than one. Crime surged in winter. It wasn't just about mischief or vice, it was about survival. The city's poorest, already stretched to their limit, found themselves pushed into desperate choices. Pickpockets were everywhere. Heavy coats and gloves made people slower, less aware. A small hand slipped into a pocket. A purse vanished. A scarf disappeared. Some thieves were no older than 8. Children trained by gangs darted through crowds with practiced skill. They didn't steal for fun. They stole to eat. Burglary rose too. Long nights gave cover to break-ins. Shops and stalls, already struggling, found their windows smashed, their goods gone. Even homes in poor districts were raided by neighbors too hungry to wait. In a season where warmth was a form of wealth, anything that could burn became a target. Coal, wood, even furniture stolen, traded, or burned. Prostitution increased with the cold. Women and girls stood on corners, wrapped in whatever layers they could find, waiting for someone who had money and the need for warmth or company. It was dangerous work. Violence, disease, arrest, all constant risks. But when the choice was between the street and starvation, many chose the street. Fights broke out in alleys and outside taverns. Cheap gin fueled tempers. The cold numbed consequences. A shove, a curse, a knife pulled in silence. The fog muffled the cries. The darkness hid the blood. The police tried to keep up. Their lanterns bobbed through the mist. But the city was too large, the alleys too narrow, the desperation too deep. The law, like the gaslight, flickered, but didn't reach far. Some crimes were committed just to escape the cold. A man would steal a loaf, knowing he'd be caught, because a cell meant warmth and food. A woman would beg in a rich district until she was arrested, because prison was better than the street. For many, the law became a strange kind of shelter. Still, even among this struggle, there was kindness. Neighbors watched out for one another. People shared scraps, and some criminals, if they could be called that, stole only what they needed. In winter, the line between wrong and necessary blurred. In Victorian London, crime in winter wasn't always about greed. It was about frost-bitten fingers, rumbling stomachs, and a city that turned its back when the cold set in. And for those living in the shadows, sometimes survival meant breaking the rules. In the heart of the coldest season, as breath hung in the air and the streets grew hard with frost, Londoners craved more than food or fire. They craved escape, and they found it in entertainment. It came in grand theatres and smoky music halls, in basement penny shows, and on frozen street corners. It was loud, bright, alive. The rich filled velvet seats in the West End. They watched operas, Shakespeare, and elaborate pantomimes, wrapped in fur-lined coats, warmed by footstools and flickering chandeliers. The performances transported them to other worlds, lands of romance, war, fantasy, and laughter. The cold outside was forgotten for a few hours. Music halls, built for the working class, pulsed with life for the price of a penny or two. Audiences packed in, shoulder to shoulder, mugs of ale in hand. Singers belted bawdy songs. Comedians shouted over laughter. Acrobats and dancers flew across the stage. It was chaotic, smoky, rough, and it was joy. Children, too, found their own theatres. Penny gaffs offered crude plays, puppet shows, and dramatic tales of villains and heroes. The floors were sticky, the air damp, the seating hard, but their eyes lit up just the same. On the streets, performers risked frostbite to entertain. Fire eaters, jugglers, musicians, they stood in the snow, hats on the ground, hoping for coins. Some nights the crowd gathered as a fiddler played a tune that cut through the cold, like sunlight. The magic was real, if only for a moment. Christmas brought its own burst of wonder. Carolers sang on stoops. Churches hosted nativity plays. Children clapped for actors dressed as kings and angels. Charities handed out sweets, toys, and tickets to special shows. Even the poorest families saved a coin or two, just to give their children a taste of joy. In upper-class homes, the entertainment came to them. Pianists played in drawing rooms. Singers performed for invited guests. Poetry was read by firelight. Laughter, applause, music, all signs that the season hadn't won. Entertainment was not frivolous. It was fuel for the spirit. When hands were numb and bellies empty, a song could warm the heart. A joke could lift the soul. A performance could remind people that joy still existed. In those moments, wrapped in music and laughter, even the cold had to wait outside. Getting around Victorian London was never easy, but in winter it became a true ordeal. Snow turned cobblestones slick. Ice shattered wheels and slowed every journey. And fog, that thick, choking fog, erased the path ahead. Whether in a private carriage or on foot, winter made every step a risk. Horse-drawn carriages were the main way to move through the city, but in the cold, horses struggled. Their hooves slipped on frozen streets. Some collapsed from exhaustion, their breath steaming in the air. Carts overturned. Wheels splintered. The sound of metal and wood cracking under strain became familiar. Omnibuses and hansom cabs crept through fog so thick that drivers sometimes couldn't see the lamps ahead. They navigated by memory, instinct, and shouted warnings. Accidents were frequent. People fell. Carriages collided. The city moved like a blind man feeling his way through darkness. Pedestrians fared no better. Most walked. The poor had no choice. But shoes, when they had them, were often thin, soaked through, or falling apart. Slush soaked their feet. Ice cut into their soles. Crossing a bridge meant facing winds so sharp they burned. Children sent on errands disappeared into fog. Some never made it home. Others collapsed on doorsteps, too cold to go further. The railways promised speed, but even they faltered. Snow blocked tracks. Ice froze switches. Trains stopped mid-journey, leaving passengers stranded in freezing cars. Stations filled with crowds waiting for transport that might never come. The wealthy had some comfort: fur-lined carriages, drivers to guide them, private rail compartments. But delays still plagued them. Even wealth couldn't melt the ice. Street sweepers and lamplighters became unsung heroes. They cleared paths, lit lamps, and guided lost travelers. Policemen helped people cross intersections choked with mist. They shouted warnings, waved lanterns, and kept the flow moving slowly, painfully, but moving. Winter reminded the city how fragile it was. A few inches of snow could bring it to its knees. A night of fog could paralyze its roads. And yet, people pressed on. Boots on ice, wheels in ruts, voices calling out in the dark. Because even when the streets turned hostile, life in London never stopped. Behind every stall, in every kitchen, and under every roof, winter pressed hard on the question of food. For over 2 million people, eating was no longer routine. It was strategy. The markets groaned with need. Supplies tightened. Prices rose. The cold dictated what could be found, and what could not. At dawn, markets like Smithfield and Covent Garden came alive. Butchers carved frozen carcasses. Fishmongers soared through blocks of ice to reach their catch. Farmers unloaded turnips, onions and cabbages. Whatever the frost hadn't killed. The air bit at faces, stiffened hands and burned lungs. But business continued. It had to. For the wealthy, shopping was selective. Servants picked the best cuts. Exotic fruits arrived from far away. Grapes, citrus, pineapples. Kitchens buzzed with stews, roasts and pastries. Tables overflowed. Meals weren't just about nourishment, they were displays. The middle class watched their spending but still managed. Preserved goods helped. Root vegetables, cured meats, bread, tea and cheese. They cooked with care, stretched ingredients, and shared warm meals in tidy homes. But for the poor, food was uncertainty. A loaf of bread could cost half a day's wages. Meat was a luxury. Potatoes were precious. Most made do with thin soups, scraps, or street food. Hot pies of questionable origin. Roasted chestnuts. A cup of weak coffee, enough to warm the hands, if not the belly. Charities helped. Soup kitchens ladled broth and bread. Churches handed out rations. Coal and food were given at Christmas. But demand was endless. Supplies ran out. Preserving food was a battle. Without ice boxes, families stored what they could. The cold helped, sometimes, but so did hunger. Nothing lasted long when mouths were waiting. In the wealthiest homes, Christmas feasts gleamed under candlelight. In the poorest, a piece of meat on the table could bring tears. The contrast was sharp, cruel, real. Food in winter was more than survival. It was status. It was hope. It was the difference between a night spent warm and full, or shivering, listening to a child cry from hunger. And in that difference, the story of the city was written. Winter in Victorian London tested everyone. But no one more than women. Behind every flickering fire, every stitched blanket, and every scraped-together meal, stood a woman who made it happen. Their hands bled, their backs ached, their courage went unseen. In working-class homes, women woke before the sun. They lit fires if they had fuel. They fetched water if it hadn't frozen. They cooked with scraps, patched clothes with threadbare fabric. They gave their children the last bite and said they weren't hungry. They were always cold, always tired. Some took in laundry. Others sewed or cleaned. Some sold goods on the street. Their fingers cracked from cold water, their feet numb in worn shoes. But they kept going, because they had to. Middle-class women managed households, ordered coal, planned meals, and supervised servants. They kept homes respectable, clean, presentable. The weight was different, but it was still heavy. Wealthy women directed holiday gatherings, oversaw charitable work, and ensured appearances remained perfect. Their hands didn't blister, but they were still expected to hold everything together. And when things broke, it was women who repaired them. When men lost jobs, or children fell ill, or fires went out, it was women who found solutions. Many did it alone. Widows, abandoned wives, girls raising siblings. Some turned to desperate work, prostitution, hard labor, whatever the streets allowed. They were judged, ignored, but never stop. Women held London's winters together, quietly, fiercely, without. They were the unseen fire in a season built of ice. Children were the smallest victims of winter, and the most resilient. Their bodies bent under the weight of cold, hunger, and disease. But somehow they kept laughing, kept running, kept hope. Poor children worked, sold newspapers, matches, flowers. They carried water, swept steps, ran errands. Their fingers blue, their noses red, their eyes older than their years. They shivered in thin clothes, ate too little, slept too little. Many got sick, many died. School was a luxury, many stayed home to help. Those who went sat in freezing classrooms, breath visible as they wrote. Orphans fared worst. They slept where they could, picked pockets, joined gangs, begged for bread. Some stole, some vanished. But when snow fell, they played. They built snowmen, threw snowballs, laughed. And for a moment, they were just children. Charities gave toys, oranges, and warm meals. Not much, but enough to spark wonder. The contrast was cruel. In wealthy homes, children skated, read books by the fire, opened gifts. Across town, others curled up under rags, hoping for one more day. Yet still, they smiled. Still, they endured. Winter revealed everything: the struggle, the strength, the spirit. And the children of London, fragile and brave, bore witness to it all.